It all started when the main character's mother inquired about his job search. She continued to pester him even while he was eating, asking him what he would do when they were gone. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore and wanted her to shut up. Although she still continued to say that no matter what he told them, nothing had changed for a long time. Listening to all this, his appetite completely disappeared, and he decided to leave, just so as not to hear all this. After finishing school, he entered a regular university, which anyone could get into, and all was well. But then problems began. At first, he struggled to find a job even before finishing his studies. But he didn't have any special skills to get a job in a good company, and because of this, he lost his motivation. At the same time, one of his friends decided to boast that he had been hired. And he was happy for him, but he couldn't boast of the same. And at this rate, 10 years passed. His mother chattered incessantly about how the neighbors already had great jobs and lovely children, unlike him. But he himself knew this very well. Alan turned around when he heard the intercom ring, and in the small window, the face of the courier appeared, announcing the arrival of the parcel. The logo on the packaging didn't seem particularly familiar to him. The woman was worried that he would buy all sorts of junk again, but this time it was some kind of win. To distract himself from his feelings of guilt, he took part in all sorts of pranks, and sometimes even won something. Most often, these were things for adults, so he had to check what was inside beforehand. The courier said that a signature or a stamp was required, and when he met Alan's gaze, the boy shuddered. People often looked at him like that when they saw him, so he wasn't surprised. But from the outside, the package looked quite small, and the first thing his mother thought was that there might be food there. And because of this, I was offended. Inside the box was a disc with an unknown game. Judging by what was written, it was called The Village of Destiny. The letter stated that he had been selected to participate in an alpha test of a game that uses the latest version of artificial intelligence. He will be a god who controls fate and grants prophecies, which he can give once a day. The description seemed rather banal to Alan, since the entire game was likely supposed to revolve around building a village. It also stated that he was not allowed to disclose any details about the game's features. If he did, his rights would be revoked, and he would no longer be able to play. Also, if settlers die, the game will end and cannot be restarted. Alan found these conditions unreasonable, as they were too harsh for a regular alpha tester. Putting all of the above aside, the main question now was whether to install this suspicious file. He decided to search for information about her on the internet, but this did not yield any results. Since the disk could have many viruses, he thought it would be better to use an old computer for this. Although he didn't take all this seriously and considered it some kind of joke. Even after inserting the disk and understanding the potential risks, Alan still decided to do it, so that, as a last resort, he could write about it on Reddit. The game started, and its name appeared on the monitor screen. Without hesitation, he pressed enter, and he had never seen such cool graphics in his life. The warrior man tried to take the cart away, and monsters were chasing him. From what he saw, it looked like a medieval fantasy. There was a small family of 3 people and a girl in the cart. It was clear that the family was afraid and trembling, and the girl, sitting on her knees, tried to call upon the god of fate. The orc was very close to the cart, and he hit her with an axe. Alan continued to watch everything that was happening, and the monster had already managed to get closer to the cart. Seeing the whole situation, it was not difficult to guess that the monster planned to knock down the horse first. But the man was able to fight him off. The next orc was already on the other side. Just a little more, and he could have cut down the horse. But thanks to Alan's intervention, the book began to shine in the girl's hands, and the whole carriage was illuminated by a bright light. He made the orc go blind, and Alan himself did not understand what he had just done. The man, looking back, realized that they had managed to get very far ahead of them. And then he looked inside the cart to report that everything was fine. Alan, still confused, thought that the warrior himself had saved everyone. And, apparently, it is from this moment that the main game begins. Alan decided to try clicking on the warrior character and open his profile. It said his name was Geems. He was 26, and he was a swordsman with numerous scars. He was the girl's older brother. Her name was Kem. She was 19, and she was a priestess who believed in the god of fate, and the swordsman's younger sister. Judging by how cool the graphics looked, he guessed that it was made in Japan, and they poured a lot of money into it. But there was no time for curiosity now, and it was necessary to look at the descriptions of other characters. There was a woman named Layla, who was 30 years old. She was very reasonable, and at the same time, she had a strong influence on her husband. The man was 33 years old. His name was Rhodus, and he ran a small grocery store. The little girl's name was Carol. She was 7 years old. She was energetic and sensible beyond her years. Although he was interested in watching them, he first needed to figure out where the controls were. Alan was trying to find a piece of paper that said something about some kind of prophecy, or something like that. But before he had time to find it, the speaker made a strange sound, and the dialogue box in the game popped up in text form, since this version was not yet fully voiced. The swordsman apologized for the fact that, even though he was the head of the guard, all he could do was give them the opportunity to escape. They tried to calm him down, saying that it was a miracle that they were able to survive despite being attacked by so many monsters. The baby was now most interested in what that bright light was, and she thought that all of this was the work of games. Then she was a little jealous, because the little girl called her brother. One might assume that the girl has a little brother complex. The swordsman was quite handsome, and was most likely supposed to be the main character. He tried to tell his sister that it was irresponsible to react to a child like that, and Carol was only glad to hear him scold her. All the characters' personalities were perfectly written, so maybe Alan's opinion has changed, and it's not such a bad game. Layla drew everyone's attention to herself, because she wanted to find out about the other world. I tried to tell them about this earlier, but their conversation kept getting interrupted. Now, she was finally able to explain that the light had come from the Bible in her hands. The game system told him that he now had to show the settlement the path to development and could not manage them directly. It was surprising that you could write text for directions rather than just select options. At first, he thought the game was only capable of understanding simple words, and at best, sentences. It took him some time to write the lyrics, because he wanted them to sound like they were spoken by God. If artificial intelligence can understand even a tenth of what is written, it will admit that this game is divine. And with anticipation, he sent what he had written. After this, the book in the girl's hands lit up. And now she had no doubt that all this was the work of God. She explained to those around her that they had received a prophecy from the God of Destiny, and she showed the book to the men. Seeing what was written, Rhodus also considered it a miracle. Only Carol and Layla were illiterate, and therefore could not read. The swordsman admitted that he could only read simple words, and complex ones were beyond his reach, so he wanted the girl to read them for everyone. The god of fate called them those who escaped from certain death. He was pleased to see that with the help of his miracle, they were able to escape from the monsters. From this day on, he will give them one prophecy each, and now they must begin to prepare wood and protect the place where they live. Even Alan himself didn't expect this. After hearing this, Layla and Rhodus were grateful to God for his help, and little Carol watched them, and repeating, she folded her hands in prayer. Everything that was happening now seemed to Alan as if they had completely understood what he had written, and such technology could be decades ahead of its time. If the characters could understand and react to everything, then it was the most brilliant game. But he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps they were following a predetermined cycle of actions. Then suggested splitting up and cutting down several trees. Rhodus wanted to ask a question. There were plenty of trees here, but they would need to be processed and given some time to dry out in order to be used as timber. It seemed that she didn't know that wood needed to be dried, and Alan was surprised that in this world, after trees are cut down, they do not immediately turn into building materials. The trees contained a lot of moisture, so they needed to dry out to maintain their shape. Otherwise, defects would appear. What chem that Alan didn't know about this? Still, the man decided not to despair and cut down a few trees first. If they couldn't use them, they would save them for later. Rhodus took the necessary tools out of the cart, and the girls were walking through the forest. Watching them, Alan came to the conclusion that the men would cut down trees, and the girls would go in search of something edible. At some point, he realized that if he turned the mouse wheel, he could zoom in or out on the camera. And to begin with, he was interested in examining the current location, so he moved it away. Judging by the thin, elongated area, this is the path they used to hide. And this is one of those games where the visible area expands as you explore it. Now he was not even interested in this, but in how time flows in this game. And if it happens completely in real time, then he has no choice but to sit and watch. He hoped that this was just his imagination, because it would be extremely difficult to pull off. Another pop-up window stated that he could use destiny points to perform miracles. Alan had no idea what these glasses were, so he read that he could get them for his gratitude. In the upper right corner of the screen was a number indicating the number of points he currently had. The more grateful residents, the more points. And if the number of residents increases, so does the point count. He also receives points from the residents for his prophecy. The fact that the number of points depended on the content of the prophecy made the game a little more difficult for him. According to the game, if a village prospers and the number of inhabitants increases, the effect of miracles also increases. And now it was high time to look at these so-called miracles. He had at his disposal a visit from a merchant. A traveling doctor will look into the village, hunters will stop nearby, and a reunion of the surviving inhabitants. Now it finally dawned on him that since he became the god of fate, he could influence people's faith. And he could even control the weather. Since he didn't have that many points yet, he didn't know which miracles to use now. The best solution was to listen to what the settlers were saying and go from there. It was a great relief to Rhodas to know that they were under the protection of the god of fate. Games agreed with his words. Alan noticed that Games answered all of Rhodes' questions very dryly, and no matter how hard he tried, it never developed into a full-fledged conversation. And since there would be no benefit from this conversation, he wanted to find out how the girls were doing. When asked what, Layla replied that they had 3 boxes of provisions, which would last for 2 weeks. I hoped that during this time, they would find a stable source of food. Alan was thinking about choosing a merchant's visit so they could buy food. But first, I decided to scout out the situation. It would have been good to take Games, but he could not leave the inhabitants without their protector. To win the game for now, he decided to use the girl to expand the visible area. But he changed his mind, because due to his thoughtless actions, they could die. Among the wonders, he found a familiar, thinking that with its help, he could explore undiscovered areas of the map. Besides that, there were also unicorns, slimes, and a bunch of other nonsense. But they all turned out to be way too expensive. And even a basic dog or cat as a familiar cost too much. The most he could afford was chicken. She could lay eggs and help with food, but she was not fit for reconnaissance. But just when he was starting to despair, the system told him that there was another way to increase his score, using the payment system. If he pays 1,000 yen, destiny points will be added to his account. In this way, they implemented the most unpleasant system for unemployed people like him. If he contributes 20,000 yen, he can afford a cat or a small dog, and use the remaining points to provide for the settlers. Without thinking twice, he reached into the desk drawer. And the numbers on the card did not make him happy. After all, he only had a little more than 10,000 left. He might consider selling the books and games he had accumulated and getting a decent amount of money for it. And besides that, he could take all the unopened prizes and put them up for auction. It was hard with this mess of thoughts in my head. Alan sat until 9 o'clock, and when I looked at the screen, everyone was already getting ready to go to bed. Then and Carol wished Games good night, while he was sitting outside near the cart. Rhodas wanted to know from him why he didn't go to sleep with them, but he wanted to remain on guard, as it was unknown when the monsters would begin to attack again. Rhodas did not want to object to him, but he could not help but remember the divine miracle. If the god of fate is really watching over them, then the monsters won't come near them. Games would be glad if this were true, but Alan had never had such powers. If they continue like this, they might think that their god is all-powerful, and maybe he should be told that he has limitations. But if he does this, he will not get many points for gratitude to God. For now, he decided not to interfere and to look for information about the forestry industry. It had been a while since he had been seriously searching for anything, as all he had done all this time was watch videos. If he had spent that time learning something, he would have been able to give more valuable advice to the settlers. And if he had money, or if there had been a working person in his place, then surely these characters would have had a calmer life. Alan himself did not understand why he regretted the past while playing the game, although games should bring joy. Suddenly, his side began to hurt, and he lifted his jacket, revealing a scar. He had already gotten used to the fact that when it started to get cold, the scar made itself known. And each time, bad memories came flooding back to him. When he was younger, he tried his best to stand up for his sister. He shouted at the guy opposite him not to dare approach her, but he remained silent, which is why Alan began to get aggressive. The guy muttered something incomprehensible, what Alan failed to recognize, and at that very moment his sister screamed in fear, and blood began to drip near his feet. The guy opposite him stabbed him with a knife, after which Alan fell, and he pulled the knife out of him. But he still threatened to stab him again. There was a creepy smile on his face. Panic gripped Alan at that moment, and all he could do was call for help. And it was at that moment that he left something important behind, and, like a coward, ran away. After that moment, no matter what he did, nothing ever worked out for him. He decided to put an end to his sad thoughts and dive back into the game, since there was nothing else he could do. After some time, he woke up on the bed, and I didn't expect that morning would come so quickly, and I didn't even notice how I fell asleep. He hadn't gotten up at such an hour for a long time. The first thing he did was immediately go to the computer, and I noticed that everyone was already awake. It really felt like the characters' lives were happening in real time. He wanted to think about what he should write in the prophecy today, but his stomach began to rumble. So it was worth eating first, because yesterday he was so focused on the game that he completely forgot about lunch, and he ate all the snacks he had long ago. Alan decided to go down to the kitchen and find out if there was anyone there, and a familiar voice sounded, the one I wanted to hear the least. His mother, father, and younger sister were sitting at the table, talking about various work matters. Ever since that incident, his father and sister had argued about work, but they never spoke to him directly about it. One day, he came out to their kitchen, wished them good morning, and asked if he could have breakfast with them. But it all ended with them reminding him of work again, and now he couldn't look them in the eye. That's why I decided not to go there now, and do a little exercise instead. After what happened, training became a habit for him. After all, he was worried that he had run away last time. The game made a strange sound again, and he turned his attention to the screen. Layla and little Carol were carrying something in their hands, and Rodis warned her that if she needed help, she should call her dad, and she promised that she would do so. Alan felt a little uneasy that the game characters looked more alive than he did, but now he wanted to warn them not to put too much trust in God. The Bible in my hands, what lit it up with? And she shouted to everyone that they had received a new prophecy. The girl read that he had now lost most of his strength and was only able to observe and grant small miracles. Therefore, he wanted everyone to join forces. Their silence made Alan a little uneasy. He thought they were disappointed in him, and he needed to come up with a better reason. But his thoughts did not come true, because Kem considered it wonderful that God was watching over them, and Rodis was very happy. Therefore, I suggested that everyone become even stronger and strengthen their position. Alan didn't expect the game to go his way. Fortunately, even the number of points increased. He was a little disappointed that there weren't many of them, but he hoped that he could activate the miracle at least once a week. At this rate, he wasn't sure he could ensure a quiet life, and he clearly remembered the girl's conversation earlier in the morning. Then she believed that it was not profitable for them to sleep in the cart, and that they needed protection from monsters in the form of a fence. Layla understood this, but the logs they had were needed to build the house, so they couldn't be used. If Alan had a few more fate points, he could solve some issues, but he can't spend the ones he has now. The only way was to donate, so he put all his unopened winnings up for auction, and he decided to think about what else he could sell. He found a few items that he could take to the flea market and make a quick buck. But the problem was that in order to sell them, you had to go outside. He didn't go outside for about 2 years. But he will be sad if he loses and can't play anymore. And he had no choice but to decide to go out. Alan felt like he hadn't gained much weight during this time, but his clothes had become tight. When he was a child, he imagined himself at the age of 30 as a refined person, and could not imagine that he would turn into something like this. Suddenly, he wanted to change his mind, and sat down at the computer again. Carol carried sticks for the fire, but she tripped and fell, dropping everything from her hands. Alan wanted to help her, but the girl wiped away her tears, and again she collected all the branches in her hands. The men continued to carry logs, and the women washed clothes. Despite the cold hands, something in Alan suddenly changed, and he was determined to try. As soon as he reached the front door, his mother came out into the hallway, and she was surprised because he didn't leave often, but he didn't explain anything. He took his bicycle with him, and, of course, the neighbors couldn't help but notice, who began to whisper. He couldn't help but feel lousy, realizing that he was living off his parents. But an image of characters from the game popped into his head, and he got ready, after which he sat on his bike. He stopped at a nearby store, and I decided to look at books that could help with building a village. He found something similar in the Other Worlds genre. In such books, knowledge from another world would be commonplace, and although the situation in the game was somewhat different, they could prove useful. But right now, he couldn't afford to buy anything, even if it only cost a couple hundred yen. He passed by a small bakery, and I remembered how, as a child, I often went here with my family. He decided to go there. Nearby, there was a family whose children were choosing sweets for themselves. She reminded him of his own family. Still, he decided to spend some money to buy 4 puddings. Sometime later, he returned home, and he handed his mother a bag of pudding. She was surprised and thanked him for it. He clarified that he bought it for everyone. As he climbed up, he was surprised at himself for being embarrassed. After all, he believed that he should not feel satisfaction after just one good deed, and thoughts about what he was doing at his age constantly gnawed at him. Thanks to the items he sold, he managed to put 20,000 yen into the game, and get 310 points for it. Now, all that remains is to decide what miracle to perform for him. He discovered that he could view past conversations of residents. He was a little worried about being eavesdropped on, so he didn't want to use it. But if he wants to fulfill several wishes, then he has no other choice. And so I wanted to take a peek to understand how it works. Layla was talking about how nice the weather was today, and Kem was hoping that they wouldn't encounter any monsters in the future. It was great that the laundry would dry quickly, and the river was close. I would have liked to take a bath, but I didn't think it would be a good idea to undress because of the monsters and men. Layla wouldn't mind if someone saw her naked, since her husband and daughter often saw her that way. But Games would hardly be interested. Carol didn't mind either, but Kem categorically refused. Alan didn't think he had to worry about Layla and Carol, but Cham's brother complex was more serious than he expected. Judging by the rest of the dialogue, it was just normal everyday chatter. The woman was still curious about what happened to the crowd of monsters that attacked their village. Their village was quite large, and had an excellent stone wall, which was more reliable than in other settlements. They even had a few hunters like her brother, but it all ended tragically. Carol hoped that the uncle and aunt she knew who lived next door were okay. Now, Alan began to understand little by little what had happened to them. From other conversations, he managed to find out that several hundred residents lived in the village. When they were attacked by monsters, they tried to resist, but in the end almost all of them were killed, and those who survived fled. And some of the residents managed to escape in a horse-drawn cart. They managed to escape the monsters, but the cart was damaged, making long-distance travel a problem. Now he understood why the description of the miracle specified the reunification of the surviving residents, and in the end, he must make sure that all the inhabitants lived together again. Alan's mother shouted to him that the food was ready. When he went down to the kitchen, he saw his father. It was rare for him to see him return home so early. After he became unemployed, they saw each other a couple of times a month, but their conversation was very dry. And such relationships continued even after the incident. The man asked if his younger sister was still at work. It was nothing new to him that she would be late again. Unlike Alan, she worked hard and got into the industry she wanted. Even the long hours didn't bother her. His mother suddenly remembered that Okiku-san had given her some homemade pickles. The old lady she was talking about was the oldest landlady who lived in a big old house nearby. In the past, when he played with his friends, she often brought candy. Although their house was not as big as hers, it was still quite spacious, and even had its own garden. This is why he could remain unemployed, and not be afraid of being thrown out of the house. And his father was a workaholic with a decent income. Alan thanked him for the food and was about to leave, but the woman told him to take some pudding with him. The mother offered it to the father, saying that he had bought it for them. In that case, the man was not averse to trying. Returning to his room, he ate the pudding, and again he sat down at the computer. From what he saw, Games was back on night watch. He looked like a reliable person, and the aura around him was somewhat similar to his father. He was the only fighter among the villagers. His sister could use healing magic, but she was unsuited for combat. In that case, both he and the inhabitants were, in a sense, dependent on Gamies. And he wished they had more free hands. Alan could summon people to the village with a miracle, but it would be very expensive. Although there was a cheaper option, it would have been random with gambling mechanics and unpredictability. If he is unlucky, they might turn out to be bandits, and defeat will be just around the corner. But he also needed a familiar and glasses, which were for the case of great need. He still didn't understand why he was getting so worked up over a simple game. And I decided to think it all over tomorrow, because I was tired after going outside for the first time. He said goodnight to Games, but suddenly the speaker started beeping, and a notification of an attack arrived. Games shouted at everyone to wake up. and everyone looked out of the carriage to find out what had happened. The boy sensed that monsters were approaching and told his sister to protect the others and not get out of the carriage. Carol hoped that everything would be okay with them, and Games told her to rely on him. How I wanted to help him. But since she could only use healing magic, he counted on her to take care of everyone else. She had no choice but to nod. Alan tried to spot the monsters in a panic, but because of the darkness, he couldn't see anything. 2 black dogs came out of the forest, and although the game warned about the attack, Alan still hoped that they would not appear. The information about the monster said that it was a stray dog that had been turned into a monster, and some had poisoned claws. Judging by all these characteristics, the odds were clearly not in Games' favor. He prepared his swords. Alan began to pray that everything would work out for him. But he suddenly remembered that he was a god and could perform some kind of miracle. Games rushed at the dogs and was able to knock them out. Alan was glad that everything worked out for him, and Kem ran up to the guy to find out if everything was okay with him. But he told her that from now on he was counting on her. And he fell. Alan started to panic again, because he thought he had managed to cut it dry. Then she picked him up in her arms, begging him not to die. She felt him become colder, and Alan couldn't understand what was happening. Rhodus's family ran out, trying to calm her down. Games still had a pulse, but his body temperature was slowly dropping, and his face was starting to turn pale. He noticed a wound on his arm, and, having compared everything that happened, I realized what the problem was. Most likely, poison got into the wound, and he asked if Kem could use an antidote spell. Alan felt a little better when he remembered her ability to do healing magic. And if she succeeded, then Games would be healed. But unexpectedly for everyone, the girl said that she had not yet learned a single spell. Then she tried to find out if there was an antidote in their luggage. But unfortunately, there was none. Carol was scared and ready to cry, and Kem didn't want to let her brother go. She begged God to save him and was ready to do anything, but he himself did not know what to do. And if he can't do anything, then Games will die, and the game will be over. He collected his thoughts, remembering that he was God in this game, and there was no need for him to panic. And in this situation, only his miracle can help. He remembered that he seemed to have seen an option that could save Games, and I found a miracle called the Wandering Doctor. It cost 300 points, but at least the doctor would definitely have an antidote, and he had no choice but to take the risk. His mother tried to tell him not to make noise, as it was already late, but he was more concerned about whether it would be suspicious if the doctor showed up right away. He played for so long that it was already past midnight, and thanks to Alan, a wandering doctor appeared from the forest, then immediately pressed her brother to herself, trying to find out who it was, and Rhodus tried to defend himself. It was not surprising that this man was suspected, but he had a plan. He wrote the prophecy in the book, thereby calming Kem, and she thanked God with all sincerity. The doctor asked to be given the opportunity to look at the man, and although Kem still didn't trust him too much, she was forced to allow it. Little Carol was also worried and hoped that everything would be fine. The doctor examined his wound, and then he took out a small bottle. He poured some of it into Games's mouth, and the rest is at hand. And after that, his complexion became much better. Everyone was very happy about this, and Alan breathed a sigh of relief. He would like to thank the doctor, but he didn't even know whether it was a woman or a man. Raising the Bible from the ground, Rhodus read that God had sent a doctor to them and would grant favor to the brave warrior. Although he was already tired of writing in a way that made it sound divine, he was interested in how people would react to it. Everyone had done a great job today, but from now on, he could only watch. After that, Layla and Carol picked berries, and she hoped that after them, Games would feel better, and Rhodus stood guard. When he heard a rustling in the bushes, he panicked a little, but a hare crawled out from there, and at that moment, he realized how stupid he looked. Games was still not fully recovered, and the doctor who was with him was grinding herbs. The girl wanted to know from him why he came here at all. He came from a family of hereditary doctors, and the place was called the Forbidden Forest, and despite the monsters, there were many healing herbs here. Last night, he had just finished gathering herbs and was about to set up camp. He saw a pillar of light and doubted whether he should go there, but still decided to do so. I thought that this was most likely a divine command. Although he didn't really believe in gods, what happened yesterday might have changed his mind. Alan realized that he was most likely a medical agnostic. In this game, the existence of gods is acknowledged, but it is up to each person to decide whether to believe in them or not. She thought that the doctor would soon leave them, but the man believed that even if the difficult part was behind him, he could not abandon the patient. He had some free time, so he wanted to ask them to let him stay with them, and Kem was only too happy to fulfill his wish. But she didn't forget to mention that they don't have any housing yet. The doctor helped Alan out by agreeing to stay with them. But the main problem was still housing. The van was already overcrowded, so someone would have to sleep outside. Even if everything worked out this time, they didn't even have a simple bandage. If the dogs attacked, destruction would be inevitable. Games looked a little better, but he probably won't be able to walk properly for a couple of days. Rotus most likely decided to protect everyone, but this did not look very reliable. Now, they needed a safe place to live, and Alan was thinking about how to spend his fate points. The doctor remembered that there was an abandoned mine nearby where he could find shelter, and perhaps the miners had left some tools there. Alan didn't expect this, but he was happy that they would be able to secure their resting place. Rotus asked him to show him the way to that place. The destination should be a 5-minute drive from their parking lot, and it was good that they would be able to return to pick up the wood. They reached the entrance very quickly, and the doctor explained that the large door was used for transporting goods, and the smaller one was most likely the main entrance. Judging by the size, ore was mined here before, but most likely another mine with a richer vein was found. They were able to open the door, and, touching the lantern, the man lit it. When they saw what was inside, they were stunned. After all, we didn't expect that there would be such amazing conditions here. Even Alan was surprised, because this place was bigger than he thought. Even though there was dirt everywhere, this place was like heaven and earth compared to the previous one. Rotus found a room behind one of the doors, and the doctor suggested that they were dug by miners to have their own rooms. But everyone was so absorbed in the new place that they didn't even pay attention to his words. Then she told her brother that they had arrived safely at their new home. Luckily, there was even spring water here, and a stone oven with kitchen tools. But before they start settling in here, first we need to clean up this place. Because the family was able to get a place where it was safe, Alan was indebted to the doctor. Games was laid on the bed, and not far from him, sitting at a table, the doctor was making medicine. Everyone else started cleaning, but in such a way as not to wake the guy. Rotus was to remove everything unusable from the cave, but he would leave what could be restored in the corner. While sweeping, Carol noticed a bed nearby. She remembered that there were only 4 rooms here, and hoped that her brother Games would sleep with her. Kem, whose face somewhat frightened Alan, was watching her monologue. She was sure that her brother would share a room with her, and was annoyed that Games spoiled Carol too much. Layla wanted to tell her something at first, but then changed her mind. Once they have converted the cave into a habitable place, they can start building a village. Alan stood up to stretch. After all, his eyes were already tired, and he was a little hungry. But when he left the room, he bumped into his sister. She wanted to eat, so she asked him to move away. But it so happened that he also needed to go to the first floor. She casually mentioned that he shouldn't use the bathroom first. Alan turned around and wanted to tell her something, but the memories of what had happened were still in his eyes, and he changed his mind about speaking, and he just said that he wouldn't use the bath. She expected him to at least object, and she didn't expect him to be such a pathetic sight. Returning back to the room, he thought that his sister was more gloomy than usual today. After what happened every time they met, it was a fight. They used to be quite friendly, and would go on vacation together, but now it was hard to even imagine that. Every time, he couldn't help but think about what would have happened to their relationship if it hadn't been for that incident. And every time that damn scar reminded him of it. But he had to move on, and no matter how much he regretted it, he couldn't change anything. He wanted to check how the settlers were doing, and then finish the game for today. They had just finished cleaning the room, and Kem told Layla that she would go check on Games. Carol also wanted to go to her older brother, but Rotus told her that the two needed to be together. Therefore, although reluctantly, the little girl agreed. Instead, Rotus suggested that she stay with her daddy and explore the cave better. Then decided to approach the doctor and ask him to look after my brother so that he could rest. He thought it was a good idea, since the symptoms of poisoning were mild, and he was ready to accept the offer. But if something unusual suddenly happens, he should be called immediately. Then she held his hand, repeating that she was near. Now that Games's condition has stabilized, it would be right to leave him alone for a while. Suddenly, a sign with the name Dream appeared near Games, and he clicked on it to find out what was going on. When he clicked, the image on the screen changed completely, and he didn't understand what kind of place he had ended up in. A young man approached the bar counter, where the girl gave him a reward for dealing with the monsters. Apparently, it was a dream in which a young Games was present. His friends suggested that they get together and go for a drink, but he refused, because I think his younger sister was waiting for him. From what Alan saw in the past, Games had an ordinary life. Returning home, he found a picture of a man drinking, and I wasn't surprised that he was drinking again. The man threw a bottle at him because he didn't like the boy's attitude towards his own father. But after that, he threw a bag of money on his table. He paid him to look after Kem while he worked. After that, the man led him to the basement, where, in tattered clothes on a rag, lay Kem. Games was stunned by her condition and did not know how many days she had been starving. Alan was also horrified and believed that this was child abuse. Games blamed himself for not being able to make the decision to leave this place with her sooner. He lifted the girl into his arms, and the man began to justify himself, saying that it was only because he was drunk, and that in the future he would keep his word. But Games no longer wanted to listen to him, and advised him to get out of the way. Frightened, the man retreated. She was interested in him, where they were going, but he himself didn't really know, as long as they were far away from here. The girl was afraid that if they didn't come back, their father would be angry. But he tried to convince her that they would never see him again, and there was no need to be afraid. Little Cham blamed herself for all her troubles, because she thought she was a bad girl, for which she was constantly scolded. Games tried to convince her that this was not true, and that they were actually the bad ones. She thought this way because she was constantly told that she should be sold into slavery, because she was a bad girl and of no use. He lowered her down, and he asked her to no longer consider these two as her parents, and to forget them. From that moment on, he invited her to live with him. She was very glad that her brother was next to her. After this scene, the screen returned to normal. And now, Alan had a little idea how Kem had developed a brother complex. Having such a cool older brother, it was understandable why she depended on him. Suddenly he woke up, and she immediately rushed to hug him in joy. The others were also glad that he woke up. Now Alan could rest, because there was no other person as reliable as Games. A character like him always becomes popular, unlike him, and he always risked his life to protect his family, and was confident that the bond between them would never weaken. What I couldn't tell about my own. Suddenly he started crying, and he himself didn't even understand at what moment. Now he really wanted to change. The next morning, his father and sister left for work, chatting about the tie she had given him, and there seemed to be some kind of ease between them. Alan looked at them from the window, and then he sat down at the computer. Layla wanted to cook dinner, while Games and the doctor were patrolling the area. 3 days have passed since the characters moved into their new home. It was very good that the cave was furnished with furniture and equipment necessary for life. The lives of the settlers improved dramatically, and the costs were fully recouped. While they were examining the surroundings, a boar ran towards them, but Games was able to stop him. Meanwhile, the doctor was already preparing the bow and arrows, and with a clear shot, he hit the boar. He asked Games not to overexert himself, as he was still recovering. As it turned out, the doctor Alan called was named Mulus. He was not only a good doctor, but also a master of bow and arrow. In addition, he was able to use magic that manipulates plants. So the drying of the trees was completed in the blink of an eye. Alan still hadn't lost hope that he would want to join the village. All this time he was treated as a guest, and nothing was known about him, and the conditions of his accession were also unclear. They tied up the boar and dragged it. At the entrance, they were met by Kem and Carol. Everyone was very happy that they would have meat for lunch today, but they didn't have much salt and seasonings left, and they were very important. Alan knew it would bother them. No matter how bountiful the wild plant harvest, they need a stable food source and have no choice but to cultivate the field. If they wanted to buy seeds for planting and seasoning, he could call a traveling salesman. But there was a miracle he wanted to activate first. And this familiar is Golem. These are large monsters made of stone that can be counted on for firepower, and the ability to work all day long. And the most tempting thing was that it could be controlled with a gamepad, and participate in the game directly. But to summon him, he needed 700 points. In real money terms, this was 70,000 yen. He had already spent 300 points to call the doctor, but thanks to his gratitude, he restored the number to 160. Every day he could receive 10 points, and if he did not spend any money for 2 months, he would be able to accumulate the required amount. But that would take a very long time. All he could do was donate, but his savings were already exhausted. He watched as they all gathered around the table to eat, and I decided to make myself some coffee. He remembered how a couple of days ago, Games and Cham had been making something together. When they were almost finished, the girl asked her brother if it would look disrespectful that they did this to him. But he believed that the main thing was her feelings. The doctor asked if this was really an altar and a statue of God. She confirmed this, because they needed a place where they could pray and make offerings. Whatever she thought, Alan was glad to see it. Because the statue was roughly carved, it was unclear what gender it was, and he always acted as if he were a male god. However, he wondered what his true gender was, then brought several pairs to the altar, which immediately dissolved, and afterward they all thanked God together. Alan was surprised by this at first, but then again, there was hardly anything to be surprised about in this world. Thanks to this offering, his points increased. The more valuable the offering, the more points you can earn. If that was indeed the case, he thought that perhaps he should tell them to bring him things they didn't need. It would be nice if they brought valuables, but he didn't want to be a burden to them. The book lit up again, and Kem called everyone, announcing that they had received a new prophecy. Reading what was written, it said that God received the offering and was very happy with the gratitude. And he clarified that they could bring him things that were extra or unnecessary for life, which he would still be able to transform into miracles. Alan tried to write as softly as possible so that they wouldn't think he was begging. Luckily, it worked, and their sincerity made Alan a little nervous. If the events had taken place in modern Japan, they would have long since been deceived by scammers or a suspicious culture. The next day, Rodas asked Games for help, and the two of them lifted the log, because, thanks to Mulis, they didn't have to worry about firewood. They laid him at the altar, and it was surprising that such large objects could be used as an offering. The thought crept into his mind that they would make offerings every day after yesterday, and I didn't quite understand why paying tribute to God was such a joyful event for them. Looking out the window, he already realized that it was getting dark. After all, when he spent time playing, it flew by very quickly. His mother told him that a package had been delivered. He came down, thinking that maybe he had won something again, and the package said it was from the Village of Destiny. Alan tried to comprehend how he had received a gift from the virtual world, and he assumed that he had somehow submitted an application to the competition. At first he thought that these were some kind of reference materials or instructions, and while he was thinking, his mother had already begun to unpack it. Inside were fruits. They looked like pears, but were red like apples, and he clearly remembered how Kem had brought a similar offering. The woman suggested leaving these exotic fruits for dessert, but he decided to take one. It looked like an apple, but had a faint citrus scent, and I decided to give it a try. It was unexpected that the fruit would turn out to be so tasty. The first thing he thought was that the game's creators wanted to surprise him, and that it's just some ordinary fruit from abroad. Returning to the room, he remembered that he should thank the settlers for yesterday, and he thanked them, clarifying that although he could live without food, he enjoyed it. They do not need to make daily offerings, because they must think about themselves first. As soon as he can collect enough points, he will be able to buy a golem. Suddenly, his mother started calling him again, but this time her voice sounded angry. A log, brought as an offering, was found on the threshold of his house, and now it seemed to him that this whole joke had gone too far. Trying to move it, he had no idea that wood could be so heavy. He told his mother that he would move her to the garden for now. She didn't have much faith in his physical fitness. It still dawned on him that he had been sent a real log. He would like to file a complaint with the gaming company. But unfortunately, there was no contact number there, so he decided to look up the address. And I was shocked that something like this was sent from Hokkaido. And even if he tried to look for their address, there was absolutely nothing about this company. If you look at the map, one building roughly corresponded to the sender's address. He found it hard to believe that the company he saw produced games of such quality, and perhaps the game was developed elsewhere. He didn't have the courage to go to Hokkaido to confirm this. He was left wondering what to do with the log. The next day, he received another delivery with a thermal container, and there was fresh meat inside. Most likely, it was the meat of that very same boar. Today, Games brought down another boar, and Chem suggested giving the God of Destiny a try. It wasn't quite what Alan wanted, because it was monster meat. His mother assumed that he was spending money on all these parcels, and he didn't understand how to explain everything that had happened. Alan decided to say that there was a place on the internet where ideas on how to revitalize the village were accepted, and his proposal was approved. So now he has spoken to the settlers, and they are sending him local produce as a gift. To his surprise, his mother believed it very quickly. In a way, he wasn't even lying, because he really did send a prophecy to help the village come back to life. He handed her a box of wild boar meat to cook, but he also hoped that it would be safe. From then on, he received something from the Village of Destiny every day, whether it's different types of fruits or monster meat. And recently, they sent me a crystal that shines when you touch it. Of course, he still didn't really believe in all this, and thought that there was probably some kind of glowing light inside him. And sometimes the logs kept coming. Already anticipating his mother's words, he said that he would deal with him, and he hoped that he could sell them somewhere. Seeing all the offerings that were sent to him, he came up with one hypothesis. Perhaps, as the settlement developed, particularly valuable items were gradually sent to the player as offerings. But in that case, it would be logical that this game was made for rich people, and he was chosen as a tester by mistake. In the evening, his mother tried to fry the meat he gave her. They really liked the meat, and the woman asked him if he could have the fruit again because she felt that she had become healthier after eating it. He could try asking the settlers. Earlier, his sister, who had tried the meat, was also delighted with it. His father expressed his opinion about the meat, emphasizing that it had good consistency and taste. It was the first time in a long time that Alan had seen his father speak such long sentences. If that's the case, then it means he was very pleased with the meat. Now that he had logs, he could try to make all sorts of wooden products and teach the settlers how to do it. But it turned out to be much more difficult than he imagined. His father came outside to find out what he was doing, and he explained to him that he wanted to use the wood and would borrow his tools. Watching Alan, the man realized that he wasn't doing very well, and he came over to help. He explained to him that he was holding the saw incorrectly. Alan thought he was doing this because he didn't want the neighbors to hear the noise. And despite the whole situation, they were still a family. After that, he handed the saw back to Alan. And from that moment on, he began to give him advice. And last weekend, they made boards together to repair the fence in the garden. It was interesting to see if he could teach the settlers how to cook meat, since his mother had taught him how to cook many times. And dining with the settlers became part of the daily routine. Now he even began to meet his sister sometimes when she returned home after work. Thanks to the Village of Destiny, he began to talk to his family much more often, and it was unclear whether he was helping the settlers or they were helping him. As Games walked around the area, he noticed that their cave was guarded only by this wooden fence, then hoped that the monsters would not be able to jump over it. Gams thought there was no reason to worry, because even if they jumped over, he and Mulis would be able to kill them. The only problem was that there could be a lot of monsters. In any case, for now, they were confident in their defense. But lately they have started to behave strangely, and they seemed a little worried, although they pretended to be calm. Even their daily conversations sounded strange and were rather boring. All this time, they were looking at the calendar, where one of the days was marked, so he was interested in what was supposed to happen then. Carol decided to take matters into her own hands and ask why everyone was so gloomy. Rhodas and Layla tried to show her that everything was supposedly fine, but despite her young age, she couldn't help but notice how they sighed when they looked at the calendar. When they were still living in the village, Rhodas told her not to leave the house on the last day of the month, and instead to hurry to bed. She remembered this, and so Rhodas asked her if she knew about the calendar in this world. According to her, every month one of the 7 gods is responsible for their world. This information turned out to be very important, so Alan decided to write it down. However, Carol did not understand why there were 7 gods if there were 12 months in a year, and at least 5 were missing. According to Rhodas, the 7 gods were originally responsible for only the week. They took turns every day, and they had many lesser gods under their command. The god of fate was one of them. After hearing the information that he was subordinate to one of the 7 gods, Alan began to understand his purpose a little better. Sometimes it happened that there was a conflict between the gods and a large-scale battle. It took them 365 days to stop the fighting, and the faction that won began to rule this world. Carol wondered what happened to the gods who lost. And, as it turned out, the losers were driven into the bowels of the earth. But sometimes they gather strength and try to appear in this world. All this happens on the last day of the month. Having put all this together, Kem realized that on this day, the power of monsters grows, making them ferocious. After checking the calendar in the game world and in the present, Alan realized that the date matched. Since today was November 20th, there were still 10 days left. Unfortunately, with the amount of points he had, he was unlikely to be able to protect the settlers. After this conversation, Rhodus remained alone at the table, and Alan noticed that he was one of those people you rarely see on your feet at such a late hour. Layla went out to find out what was going on with him, as he had not been sleeping well lately. The temptation of the evil gods just wouldn't leave my head. Last time they were lucky, no one touched them, but he couldn't stop worrying that this time he might lose his family. Layla tried to calm him down, while Alan was trying to understand what happened on that very day of the temptation of the evil gods. About 3 weeks ago, Carol woke up to find her mom and dad were gone, and I decided to tidy myself up. When she went down to the kitchen, she saw that they were there. Layla told her to go wash her face. She reached the well, and she washed herself with cool water from the trough. But unfortunately for her, she forgot to bring a towel, and had to tidy her hair with wet hands. Just at this time, Kem found her, and since Games wasn't next to her, she didn't care, then tried to catch up with her when she started to run away. But Carol managed to close the door. Layla thought she heard the girl's voice, but Carol lied and said she didn't know anything, and she began to eat the pies. After she finished eating, she told the others that she would be back soon, and when her mother asked, she replied that she was going to see her older brother, Games, and she left the house, even despite Layla's warning. Everyone around noticed that Carol was full of energy, and they even offered her to take some fruit with her. So, walking along the road, she came to a large wall, and every time I was surprised by its enormous size. Among all the guards, she found Games, and she rushed to hug him. Although he was glad to see her, she still shouldn't have gone outside. Today was a special day, and there was no child there except her. The little girl thought that it was he and other people who built this wall. But in fact, several decades ago, there was a war here, and this place was used as a fortress. And then the fugitives settled and prospered in this city. Although she didn't quite understand what he was talking about, she knew for sure that these walls protected everyone from any enemies. Finally, Layla found her, and she caught her so that she couldn't escape. One of Games' comrades asked him if he knew these people, and he explained that they had been very kind to him and his little sister. The man was surprised that there was not a drop of fear in these people, although this was not surprising, since the city was founded, no one had ever gotten through the wall. Layla apologized for her daughter and promised to scold her, although Games did not think it was necessary. And after that, they said goodbye. But he didn't rule out the possibility that things might not go the way they wanted. All the people in town started to bustle about, and Carol thought there was going to be some kind of festival. Layla didn't explain anything to her, and suggested throwing a feast tomorrow. At this time, people were dragging boards on the street and strengthening the gates. Rhodus had already collected everything he needed in the cart, just in case, and I hoped that everything would be fine, and nothing would happen. They could only pray that this day would pass without problems. When it began to get dark, arrows began to fly, to defeat the monsters trying to get through the wall. But there were many more of them than they expected, and many species united into groups. Now they wanted to concentrate their efforts on strengthening the goal defense, and hoped that the opponents would get tired. Following the arrows, spears came into play, and Games threw them. Everyone had to follow his orders to prevent these creatures from breaking into the city. The monsters came up with a new plan, and the bigger one threw the smaller one at one of the people, thereby breaking into the city. The guards did not expect to be attacked from behind, and people began to defend their homes. Layla, Rhodus, and Carol were hiding in the house, and they hoped that God would at least protect the baby. Suddenly, the door to their house was broken down. Luckily, it turned out to be Games and Chemistry. The whole family was very happy to see them. They were not wounded, and the blood on their bodies did not belong to them. Rhodus wanted to know from him how the battle was going outside. At first, he wanted to soften things and said that the situation was not very good. But afterward, he still told the truth, that the situation was hopeless. Hordes of monsters broke through the gates and entered the city, and most of the defenders perished. And in order to get them and his sister out, he shamefully left the battlefield. Unfortunately, the city was lost, and they had to flee. Rhodus pulled himself together and reported that they had a cart prepared and several boxes of supplies loaded into it. They began to come out little by little while Games covered them. All the girls managed to get there, But one of the monsters found them. Games told Rhodes to get into the cart quickly while he dealt with him. He was the first to try to attack him, but he missed, and the monster took on him in response. But in the end, Games was able to overcome him. He quickly jumped into the cart, and Rhodius drove the horses. Since the gates weren't working, he remembered that there was a section of the wall that was destroyed, and they could slip through there. Rhodes heard him, but at the same time, he could hardly control himself, seeing how monsters finished off people, and black dogs devoured corpses. While Rhodes held the reins, Gams fought off the monsters in their path, and then they drove through the hole in the wall. The monsters burned everything they could. Even Carol's favorite book was burned. At this rate, they found themselves in the forest, and Carol asked Layla if they could ever go home. She couldn't promise her this, and, to reassure her, said that many adventures awaited them, which confirmed this, because she believed that they survived thanks to the god of destiny guiding them. The same one who received this game for testing. Now Rhodes asked Games to teach him martial arts, and at first it didn't work out very well. He told the man frankly that he didn't think battle was his calling, and perhaps it would be better to leave the front lines to him and Mulis. Rhodes thought the more people the better, but perhaps he really didn't belong here. Alan was surprised by Games' straightforwardness. After that, they all sat down to eat together. But Rhodes continued to feel uneasy. Since they were running low on fruit, Layla asked Games to bring back any if he found any during his patrol. Carol wanted to go with him to help him. After all, she hadn't been able to go outside since they got into this cave. Rhodes was already tired of repeating to her that during this day, the monsters become cruel, and it is dangerous to be outside. Carol kept saying nothing would happen, and despite his attempts to dissuade her, she kept making up reasons why they should go, until Rhodes lost his temper and slammed his fist on the table, and he shouted at her to obey her father. No one expected such an outburst from Rhodes, but everyone remained silent, and Carol was ready to cry, after which she ran away, screaming that she hated him. Rhodes wanted to calm her down, but Layla was the first to run after her. Alan noticed that the man had been getting angry a lot lately. Now he could only try to cheer them up using prophecies, but that wouldn't solve their problem. Thanks to the offerings, his points grew quite well, and in theory, he could use the hunting party stays for 3 days miracle. But it was unknown how savage they would be, and perhaps they might take away everything they had. If this were a normal game, he wouldn't be so worried about little things. And the most appropriate miracle in such a situation was the summoning of a golem. He would not harm the settlers, and if something unexpected happened, Alan could adapt to the situation. But it is unlikely that he will manage to score 700 points in 10 days. He came up with the idea of asking his parents to borrow some money. But if he asked them for money to gamble, they would throw him out of the house. There's no point in even trying to ask your sister. Alan considered selling the offering from the settlers, but he wasn't sure he could get money for it, as it looked suspicious. So he was at a dead end. There was one way out, though. The easiest solution for people was to find a part-time job, but he had never worked before. He once went to an interview looking for a part-time job during his admissions process, but he was too nervous and blew his chance. But it was probably also because he was only aiming for positions with high hourly wages and generous benefits. He should have learned his lesson for the future, but when he looked for another job, he made the same mistakes. His father then decided to use his connections to recommend him to several companies. But he did something that brought shame on his father. Deep down, he hoped that if he failed the interview, it would give him an excuse not to work anymore. Now, 10 years later, he decided to try to earn some extra money. But that didn't change the fact that he was scared. He became spoiled and scared after being rejected. But now he no longer wanted anyone to be disappointed in him. People might make fun of him for trying to find a job because of some game. But if he doesn't start now, it's highly likely that he will remain like this for the rest of his days. He needed to find a job that would end this month, so that he could carry out his plan. Working in a store takes 6 months, and there was an obstacle in the form of the fact that he never communicated normally with other people. If we consider physical labor, then it is daytime work, and he was not entirely sure that he could work where force was required. There were no options for part-time work nearby, and if he had a driver's license or a motorcycle license, there would have been more options. Unfortunately, this was a side effect of him doing nothing all this time. Meanwhile, Rhodes wanted to talk to Carol about what had happened, but she demonstratively turned away from him and did not speak to him. Layla kindly suggested to her husband that he leave their daughter alone for now, Seeing what was happening on the screen, he decided that he would no longer doubt, and it will be useful for everyone. If he wanted to find a part-time job, he had to look through the free magazines where all these vacancies were posted. After that, he returned home, and his mother was surprised that he had gone out anywhere at all. But then I noticed a magazine in his bag labeled Work, and her mood immediately became more joyful. After that, he returned to his room to look through the vacancies. But after a while, he was called to dinner. Alan didn't expect the whole family to gather at the table. He praised his sister for her hard work and welcomed her home. This made her feel awkward. The girl decided to find out what had happened, since there were more festive dishes on the table. So the mother, without hiding anything, told him that Alan was looking for a job. She didn't expect him to ever have the motivation to do this, but he immediately clarified that he plans to find a part-time job for now. His father did not consider it important why he was looking for her, and thought it was good that he had the desire. Knowing his father, he thought he might say that he would only accept him if he had a regular job. His sister noticed that he had changed quite a lot lately, and suggested that he had a girlfriend, but his mother denied this. Alan couldn't help but notice that during this time, his sister had already called him Big Brother several times. His father decided to find out if his desire was connected with the settlement that was sending them various things. Alan confirmed this and said that he decided to repay them for this, even if only with a small amount. The girl was the only one who was not aware of what was being said. After dinner, his father came over to ask if he had found a job yet, and Alan replied that he had found 3 potential vacancies and would call the employers in the morning. He mentioned that the settlers would have an important matter to attend to at the end of the month, so from now on, he would be able to work at any time. My father didn't expect anything like this, because before this, he always lost interest and patience, and said that he would do it tomorrow. He wanted to give it his all, but he didn't think customer service was right for him. That's why I wanted to work somewhere that required physical activity. Seeing Alan's motivation, he said he would ask his friend to help. Alan was grateful to him, but he was afraid that if he relied on his father again, he would miss the opportunity. The father seemed to know what he was thinking, and said that the child should not be ashamed when someone tries to help him. If he wants to achieve something, he must take advantage of opportunities even from his family. At that moment, he saw Rhodes in his father. Carol is very stubborn and constantly tries to do everything herself, and Rhodes tries to convince her to rely on his help. And at that moment, his father tried to convince him to rely on him. Alan eventually gave in and asked him for help, and he went away to make a phone call. After the call was answered, he had no other choice, and although he was unsure about the job, he was now shaking. After this, the man turned around and asked if he could put on some loose clothing, and he just happened to have the right tracksuit. He was supposed to be down in half an hour. After that, he went to the bathroom to finally get himself in order, and shaved. As he put on his tracksuit, he thought that he still didn't believe that he would start working from now on, and he couldn't get the thought out of his head that he would disappoint his father again. But as soon as his hesitation reached its limit, he decided to strike in order to come to his senses and not lose his determination. When the sound came from the speaker, he decided to sit down at the computer for a moment to find out what was going on. Sitting at the table and looking at the wall, Rhodes wondered what he was doing. He wanted to get the nagging thoughts out of his head and help Layla while he was free. But Carol had already sorted out all the matters. Since they came here, she has always taken the initiative and helped. She did everything to help others, and Layla still couldn't believe that her baby was growing so fast. But Rhodes didn't even listen to her until the end and quickly disappeared. He found Carol while she was feeding the horse. He wanted to apologize to her for what happened that morning, but suddenly she started apologizing too. After their fight, everyone tried to tell her that her dad cared about her more than anything in the world and was only angry because he wanted to protect her, and so she was ready to no longer ask to go outside. But Rhodes began to calm her down and say that he was wrong because due to his fear of the temptation of the evil gods, he forgot something very important. They decided to live on this land with their friends, so they can't be afraid and isolated all the time. Carol was a full member of this settlement and could do whatever she wanted. Rhodes trusted her completely. After these words, Alan jumped up and grabbed his head. But he was grateful for it, and now it seemed to him that he had enough courage. After this, he left the room, promising that he would return soon, and he left them to celebrate the reconciliation. While his father was driving him to work, he decided to find out what his job would entail. According to the man, his friend's supermarket was short of a cleaner. After all, one of his employees recently left, and he was in dire need of help. Upon arrival, they were met by the store owner, and he thanked his friend for becoming his savior. He had already heard that this guy was a homebody, but he had a good body. His father hoped that he could rely on his friend, and after that he was going to leave. For a second, Alan even wanted to ask him like a child, "Are you leaving already?" The man asked Alan not to be nervous. If he didn't understand anything, he could ask either him or the two employees there. He introduced Alan to two workers, warning them not to give the guy any strange ideas. The girl laughed at the boss's words, saying that they never do that, and was glad to meet the new guy. And the guy immediately noticed that he was tall, so cleaning the lamps and other things would be an easy task for him. Unlike him, these two people clearly had no problems with social skills. He was new here, so he would have to put his pride aside and accept the fact that he would be incompetent. After that, he bowed and hoped that they would get along with each other. At the end of the work, the man asked if Alan could come the next day. He agreed without any problem. Tomorrow was also supposed to be a late night shift, and he was going to pick it up at 8 in the evening. The girl and the boy also said goodbye to him and hoped to see each other tomorrow. And after that, the three of them left. When he returned home, he was sure that everyone had already gone to bed. The workers treated him kindly and warmly, so he was able to calm down and complete his tasks. His job was to clean up all the dirty, foaming water, so he kept pushing the vacuum cleaner, which could suck up anything. He was also tasked with carrying things and cleaning supplies. He wanted to take a shower as soon as possible, but first he needed to drink. He found food on a plate on the table in the kitchen, and a small note that his mother left for him to eat. The food you eat after hard work tasted much better to him. Now he couldn't understand why he had been so afraid before when it came to work. The bathroom was warm, clean, and had hot water. Most likely, his mother cleaned the bathtub and prepared it for him. After all the bathing procedures, he decided to log into the game and check how the settlers were doing. And at that moment, everyone had already gone to bed. What he did today was only possible thanks to them. After all, he had been watching them work tirelessly all that time, and he too wanted to give it his all. Now he had nothing to do and had to go to bed. But when he woke up in the morning, his muscles were very sore, and he hoped that today's shift, despite the pain, would be okay. His mother wanted to warm up his lunch, but he decided to do it himself. The woman asked him how he was doing at work. Everyone was very kind to him, and the work was easy, and there would be another shift in the evening. His mother was glad that he was actually giving it his all. When he finished eating and was about to leave, she told him that he had received another package from the Village of Destiny, and judging by its small size, it came from Carol. Even though it was a mud ball, he was happy with it. The villagers thought they could only make offerings once a day, but the rules stipulate up to 2 offerings per day. Carol wanted to imitate adults. Therefore, she would send him things at random, and the number of offerings from the settlers per day was actually reduced to 1. She sent him stones, small white flowers, and shiny mud balls. And recently, even a copy of the statue of the god of fate that Games carved. He loved to watch her carve something with a knife in her hand, and it seems like she did something new today. She called Mulus and showed him the carved figure, asking what he saw, and comparing it with the statue, he guessed that it was the god of fate. He kept all the things she sent him on the shelf, although he still wasn't entirely sure who was sending him the figurines, some company employee or Carol herself. Inside him was a boy who truly believed that these offerings were sent by this very little girl. After that, he wanted to get some sleep so that the muscle pain would subside. Until then, he hadn't realized how happy his mother would be to see him working. And he was grateful that he could help others through this. His boss noticed that Alan had already become quite comfortable in this job. He sincerely believed that his entire staff consisted of good people. And that guy who was now washing the floor might have seemed pompous, but in fact, he was quite hardworking. Alan actually thought that about him at first, but he noticed how serious he was when he was working. The most important thing in work is to be diligent, which was the decisive factor. Since the manager had been wagging his tongue with Alan all this time, the girl suggested reducing his salary and increasing theirs. The man listened to their words and asked for forgiveness. But then I remembered that he decides here how much everyone gets. Judging by the atmosphere in the team, this work was quite good, and here he could give it his all. At the end of the shift, they drove him home, and he remembered that there was only a week left until that very date. so he needed to motivate himself for the sake of the residents. Since he now had less time to log into the game, he decided to look at the history of dialogues for the day. While Games was working on the fence, Kem suggested that he take a short break, and Carol, who appeared from behind, suggested taking a nap. As always, the girls started to quarrel among themselves. Games got tired of listening to this squabble and decided to leave. Later, he decided to watch the dialogue between Rhodus and Layla. As it turned out, Mulis taught him how to make antidote mixtures, although he could not yet guarantee that they would be effective. He couldn't fight on the front lines, so he wanted to help in some other way. Layla couldn't help but be happy with how reliable he was. Since no one knew how the temptation of the evil gods would turn out, they all lived their day with optimism. But suddenly he saw some suspicious chat. In correspondence, the two discussed the fugitives, and were unable to take decisive action, as they could incur God's wrath. They believed that whoever entered their sacred land must experience the justice of nature. It didn't take Alan long to realize that Mulis had been a spy all along. All this time, he thought he would be a reliable doctor, but now it was clear why he was treated like a guest character. Most likely, he was a member of the tribe living in this forest, and all this time he was vigilantly watching the settlers. But since the residents were blessed with divine protection, he had no intention of attacking directly. He felt a little better, knowing that he had played at least some role for the villagers. But if they can't count on Mulis, then only Games is left to fight the monsters. Tomorrow, he wanted to give them a prophecy with a hint of Mulis's true face. When everyone gathered for breakfast in the morning, Alan decided to send out predictions. And the book was highlighted. God wanted them to endure, despite the worries about the temptation of the evil gods. And he will try to use his powers to help a little. And if anyone poses a danger to them, he will incur the punishment of the god of fate. Because of this, Mulis became noticeably nervous. I couldn't help but notice this, so I wanted to know what happened. But naturally, he didn't admit to anything, although it was obvious that he was truly afraid of the god of fate. Games believed that with God's help, they could cope, but they also had to make every effort possible. The most important thing is that now he seems to have managed to stop Mulis from interfering. Of all the possible characters, the only one he could help with was Golem. The thought of fighting alongside Games excited Alan a little. Therefore, this week he must work hard to save money and buy the necessary destiny points. Later in the evening, the manager arrived to pick Alan up for work, but he noticed that Adrian was not with them. According to the girl, he was not feeling well, so he took the day off. Today, the three of them will be working, but in a store that is smaller than usual, so they won't spend much time. He got the job done quite quickly, and even Mother and Father had not gone to bed yet. The time it took to finish his work could vary depending on how quickly the cleaning was progressing. Suddenly, his mother remembered that he must be hungry and wanted to warm something up for him, and he couldn't help but notice that she was in a great mood today. He could ask his father why she was in a good mood, but I couldn't get rid of my self-doubt so easily. Still, he gathered his courage and wanted to ask, but at that time his mother announced that the food was ready, and he fell silent, although she made it clear with her whole appearance that she wanted him to ask about what had happened. When he finally asked, his mother wanted to say something about his father, but he coughed loudly. It all looked as if her father had become agitated and had intervened to prevent her from telling him. Without finishing this conversation, he returned to his room, and he felt that he was thrown off track because he was so inspired by his boss's words that she was counting on him. If he fell onto his bed now, he would probably fall asleep right away. At this time, Carol was already asleep, and Games, together with Kim, were already getting ready to go to bed. But Layla and Rhodus were still quite young, so he wanted to leave them alone. As for Mulis, he thought that he would abandon the settlers and disappear. Perhaps he planned to observe whether the settlers would leave before the start of the temptation of the evil gods. He could not drive him away, since the settlers began to feel more confident around him. He was already quite tired, so he wanted to go to bed. But I noticed the hieroglyph reality taken in a square. The last time he clicked on the sleep window, Game's dream appeared on the screen. Since he was too tired during the day, he just wanted to see what it was and go straight to bed. The picture on the screen immediately changed to a modern house, and the layout of the rooms inside looked exactly like his house. His brain was hardly able to comprehend it. He wanted to go back to the home screen, but he accidentally entered the bathroom, in which, at that very moment, his sister was washing herself. If this were real, and she found out that he was keeping an eye on her, she would probably kill him. He wanted to think that this was an ordinary dream. His parents were just sitting in the living room, and since he thought it was a dream, he wanted to eavesdrop. His father didn't want his mother to bring up the topic in front of their son, but she just wanted to show off the gift his father gave her for the first time in 10 years on their wedding anniversary. Alan didn't even know that today was such a significant date. The man felt sorry that he had been rather distant from his family for the past 10 years. The woman was sure that all this time his anxiety was connected with Alan. Even though he thought it was a dream, his heart stabbed when he heard those words. If you rewind back to the time he became unemployed, my father was a calmer person. He was not very talkative, but he always put in effort in everything he did. Whenever he couldn't understand some study assignment, he would explain the material to him in an accessible form. And when he cried because of his angry mother, he secretly treated him to ice cream and stayed with him until he stopped crying. All this time, he thought that his father was strict and perhaps in some ways callous. He did not want to admit his guilt in the deterioration of relations in the family and changed his memories to ennoble himself. In any case, his mother was now glad that Alan had finally found a job and was looking more cheerful. From that day on, his father always wanted to apologize to him, which was surprising to Alan because he didn't think he had to apologize. But the man could not forget what he said that day. Then he shouted at him that he was not trying hard enough and anyone could find a job. Those words shocked him because he thought he was quite serious. Linda remembered how her father himself was a laid-back guy during his university years, and in general, it was a miracle that I graduated from school. Her description was the complete opposite of her stubborn father. But it was much easier back then because companies begged to work for them. Alan was a more diligent student than he was and did everything he could to find a job. And he, who was always tormented by stupidity, overlooked his shortcomings and tried to instruct him. The man had no right to say such things then. He tried to become a father and thought that he lived honestly, bearing a great responsibility that was beyond his strength. But he only had the impression that he had done everything right and had received his son without any regrets. As a child, he couldn't stand his mother, who forced him to study. So he decided not to bother the children about their studies. But in the end, he was no different from that woman. Listening to all this, Alan felt that his father was wrong, because even despite who he was before, he always looked up to him. But the reason he was serious in the past was because he was trying to catch up with his hard-working father. Linda offered him to take the weight off his shoulders. Parents are just older people with a little more experience, but that doesn't mean they'll always do the right thing. When he was younger, he always thought that adults were the ones who should always do the right thing. But Linda thought the same thing, so she suggested they just assume they were both still growing. Just as Alan has been trying to change all this time, they too must begin to change. Alan was glad that his parents had the same ideas about adults as he did, and considered them to be proper and honest people. After that, he fell asleep right at his desk, and I woke up in the morning, noticing the familiar monitor screen, so I still thought it was just a dream. From today on, he felt like he could have an honest conversation with his parents. And going out into the kitchen, he wished everyone good morning. When November 30th arrived, he ran home as fast as he could. 2 days before, he wanted to keep a close eye on the guys while he was not working. Everyone was preparing tirelessly for this day. They repaired the fence so that there were no holes. They even built a watchtower. From this position, Mulis could take good aim at his enemies. That's why she was perfect for him. He was still staying with them, but Alan was wondering when he was going to leave, although Alan had an assumption that he would escape the moment the monsters attacked. This was his first major raid event, and in a normal game, there would have been a tutorial with reduced difficulty. But this game was clearly not an ordinary one. He had no room for error. They were carefully strengthening their defense, which was very good. If he loses, he will surely lose his thirst for life and return to the past. He didn't want to lose the progress he had made in his real life. Now he had 540 points. He only has a little time left to summon the golem. If he succeeds in this, he will become a reliable backup for the settlers if Mulis escapes. And as a bonus, he will be able to control it. He had played a lot of different games recently, so he was confident in his skills. Alan's work for this month ended late tonight, and tomorrow he will be preparing for that very day. That evening, Carol decided to approach Games to ask if everything would be okay with them, and he tried to convince her that everything would be fine, because they had strengthened their defenses well. In any case, Carol hoped that if something went wrong, her older brother would protect her. And these words irritated Kem every time. Now, they wanted to return to the main question. Could they survive everything in their current situation? Rhodus could not help but take into account what happened to their previous village. Mulis had previously mentioned that this place was called the Forbidden Forest. He didn't want to scare anyone by telling them there were all sorts of dangerous monsters living here. But it was enough for Kem that he simply agreed to help. Alan also used to think of him as a kind and reliable doctor, until he learned the whole truth. Games remembered that if they decided to leave this place, the wheels of the cart could break at any moment, and they could not repair it. According to Mulis, if he had gone alone or with Gamies, they would have been able to get out of the forest. But altogether, it is unlikely. The guy wanted to do everything possible to ensure that everyone could survive that day, and thus raise the spirits of everyone else a little. Suddenly he turned to Mulis, and he thanked him for everything he'd done. He also said he didn't want to drag him into a battle against his will. Everyone else was grateful too. Now, Alan realized that all this time everyone had had the feeling that Mulis would one day leave the village. He told everyone to raise their heads and supposedly wanted to help them. But he had a family too, so he planned to leave this place tonight. He could leave them some herbs. Carol came over and asked if he was really going to leave them. And she will miss him very much and hope that he will come and play together sometime. All this time, Alan couldn't fully understand what kind of person he was. But perhaps he wasn't so bad. He was watching everyone on behalf of the village, but he didn't seem to have any intention of causing harm. Looking at his watch, he realized that he had to go to work very soon. He promised to return as soon as possible. Today he was again pushing a huge vacuum cleaner that could suck up dirty liquid. At first it is light, but as it accumulates liquid, it becomes heavier. His boss uses a cleaning device polisher. Lily collected the liquid. He sucked everything up with a vacuum cleaner, after which Adrian mopped and waxed the floor. After working for a while, the boss announced that they were taking a 10-minute smoke break. So he decided to buy a drink from the vending machine. Adrian suddenly came up to him and was genuinely surprised that he liked tea with milk. And I also wanted to buy myself some warm tea. Since he had already addressed him, he had to answer something. So he couldn't think of anything better to say than that regular tea also sounded good. Adrian believed that since they were from the same generation, the other one should be a little simpler. But since Adrian was a little older, it was difficult for him to immediately switch to the informal you. While they were chatting, he completely forgot to spin the free gacha. During this time, he learned that Adrian bought various console games, and was an aspiring gamer who frequented cyber clubs. He decided to ask him if he played any mobile games. But as it turned out, Alan didn't even have a smartphone because he sat at home all the time. He wasn't surprised by this, since he could sit down at the computer at any moment anyway. Besides, most likely, he himself sat at home all the time and talked about his past as if it were a trifle, which impressed Alan. Then Alan asked about the recent games. Adrian had something on his mind, but he didn't have time to finish. At the end of his shift, the man hoped that Alan had some free time during the last 2 days of November, as they would have a ton of cleaning requests. He agreed and hoped that they would work together again. After work, he sat down at the computer again, and judging by the situation, Mulis had already left the cave, and on the table there were only various medicinal decoctions left. Next to them were notes detailing the effects of the decoctions and their dosage. If you think about it, Mulis could return the day after tomorrow if the settlers survive, and Alan couldn't help but get the impression that he might return, or rather, that he wanted Mulis to return. On November 29th, the atmosphere around was gloomy, and Alan wanted to somehow help them get rid of their anxiety so that they could relax. He wanted to write them something like, "God will lend a helping hand when needed," and the book What Lit Up When a New Prophecy appeared there. He wrote that they should not forget about his protection, and if danger befalls them, he will protect them. With this text, he made it clear to them that they should not rely too much on God and should not fall into despair in order to reach the end. Besides, if a golem suddenly appears, they will immediately understand that it is on their side. Since they had received divine protection, they could not afford to lose heart. The atmosphere around became a little more cheerful. He was thinking about trying out Golem's summoning right now, but he still wasn't sure how to control it. So he wanted to activate it only when there was danger, and now he had nothing to do. To keep himself busy, he decided to fry some meat and eat some fruit for dessert. Surprisingly, after they ate the food sent, his family's condition improved dramatically. He received an unexpected call and was afraid that he had done something wrong. As it turned out, work had suddenly appeared, and he could use an extra pair of hands. Although he had some plans, work was supposed to end at 9 p.m., so it wasn't a problem. The manager was glad he could count on him, since Adrian had suddenly taken the day off. This was unexpected for Alan, so he assumed that maybe he suddenly decided to relax with friends or something like that. He wanted to help him out now, so that when he needed it, he would help him out in return. And when they were almost finished, it turned out that they had changed the details of the contract. According to Lily, people would show up from time to time and try to persuade them to extend the cleaning time. Alan's watch showed 9:15 p.m. The man remembered that Alan had important things to do and wanted to let him go. But Alan said he would continue until they finished, and he hoped that the three of them would manage it in an hour. When November 30th arrived, their car was stopped on the way home, and the policeman said that there had been an accident, because of which the road was closed, and they would have to turn back. The time showed 12 hours, 37 minutes. And Alan began to get nervous, because the day of the temptation of the evil gods could already have arrived. He hoped that the monsters wouldn't invade immediately when that day arrived, but he also couldn't shake the thought that they could have done it and were now killing the settlers. He shouted to his boss that driving would have meant making a detour to get home, so he wanted to walk. He sincerely apologized for what happened, but Alan assured him not to worry, and then he said goodbye to everyone. When the car drove away, he rushed forward as fast as he could, and he didn't understand why, of all the days, he had such bad luck on this one. He ran for another hour, and he was very short of breath because he hadn't run that fast for a long time. The forces were almost exhausted, but he remembered the settlers, which gave him the strength to move on and hope that he would make it in time. When he finally got home, he quickly took off his shoes, and he ran to the second floor. He immediately looked at the monitor screen, hoping that everything was okay, and he noticed that Games was still sitting calmly at his post, looking out for suspicious activity. And judging by the fact that everyone was lying in bed, there was no hint that they were attacked by monsters. So he felt a great sense of relief. His sister came to ask why he was making noise in the middle of the night. He apologized for this, explaining that he had to do something urgently, and then he wanted to send her out of the room. But she noticed that he was sweating heavily, and his uniform was so dirty that he needed a shower. He told her that he would accept it, but a little later. But she already knew that every time he looked to the left, he was lying. She had been able to detect his lies since childhood, but only now did he understand exactly how. The girl noticed that lately he constantly leaves the computer on and plays some game. As it turned out, their mother had told her about this and strictly forbade her to turn off the computer. He had warned her about this in advance, as she was often free to enter his room. He was worried about being warned about keeping the details of the game confidential and hoped he wouldn't lose his right to play. So he only told her that it was under development. That's why he can't divulge any details, or he'll be fined. If he was that worried about it, she promised to keep an eye on the game while he took a shower. The guy understood that there was no point in arguing with her and agreed to trust her. He explained that an important event was about to happen there, but he didn't know when exactly, so she should keep her eyes on the monitor. If the characters start to be attacked by monsters, she should immediately let him know about it. He quickly went down to the bathroom and started taking a quick shower. But he thought that if he didn't wash himself well, his sister would notice that he smelled bad. So he decided to wash his hair too. When he finished, he returned to the room and thanked her for her help. She was surprised that he finished so quickly, but the main thing was that there was no smell of sweat. During this time, the characters did not move a millimeter, and the graphics, in her opinion, were incredibly cool here. It could be compared to an interactive movie. He also decided to lie about what he heard, that the developers had invested a lot of money into this game. But after he turned his back on her, she again realized that he was hiding something. He admitted it, but that didn't mean he was hiding anything bad. The girl wanted to clarify whether he could tell only her or the whole family about this. And when he made it clear to her that this was indeed the case, she got up a little sadly and went off to sleep, slamming the door behind him. However, it had been a long time since they had spoken to each other, and Alan was glad that their relationship was improving. He explored the entire area of the game, but found no traces of monsters. So maybe he shouldn't have rushed home in such a hurry. There are 22 hours left until the end of the day. By the time morning came, he had already managed to eat all the snacks he had. Before he started working, he could stay up all night. but now it felt quite hard. The monsters didn't show up that night, so he considered taking a nap. But then you may not have time to react if something does happen. Alan remembered there should have been a can of coffee in the fridge and wanted to take a short break. When he entered the kitchen, his mother was surprised that he had gotten up early, although he had returned home late. He had already told them that he had important business at the end of the month and would need to talk online with the settlers. Some more time passed, and nothing changed. Alan was already thinking that it was a bit much to be on guard all day, and he was wondering what the settlers were planning. Rhoda stepped up to replace Gamis, and Alan decided to check what the girls were doing now. Carol was busy with something and couldn't wait for tomorrow to come. And all this time, Kem prayed near the statue, hoping that tomorrow they would be able to greet the morning sun together. Alan's mind was filled with conflicting thoughts, because on the one hand, he wanted the monsters to come, but on the other hand, he didn't. After some more time had passed, he dozed off a little, but he woke up and patted himself on the cheeks to concentrate. Suddenly, Games heard some sounds and began to quickly descend. It was clear that the temptation of the evil gods had begun. Games took one of the copies, and he looked through a small hole in the fence. There were 5 black dogs approaching, and remembering what happened before, they probably had poisonous fangs. At first, Alan thought that they would not be able to penetrate so easily, and that they would retreat. They moved away a short distance, and they rushed forward to run and jump over the fence. One of them didn't succeed, as he was immediately stabbed by Games. Then, the remaining 4 decided to jump at the same time. Games managed to stab 2 of them, but the rest managed to break inside. He killed one of them without hesitation, and then he drew his swords to deal with the last one, and he did it without much effort. Of course, Alan knew all along how strong Games was, but he didn't expect it to be that strong. Carol emerged from the cave with Kem, admiring her older brother's strength, but he shouted at them not to come closer, as other monsters might appear, although Rhoda hasn't seen anyone from above yet. Layla also came out to tell her husband to be more careful. Games did not dissuade them, and still decided to accept their help. He needed help throwing the monster corpses over the palisade, and their enthusiasm noticeably faded in their eyes. Rhoda told them not to worry, because in any case, he and Games would figure everything out, and Layla called them to her so that they could help her. Luckily, they were able to suppress the initial attack, so perhaps the golem won't even be needed. In total, about 4 hours have passed since it ended. At the beginning of Temptation of the Evil Gods, Games was able to defeat everyone single-handedly. Alan watched as Kem brought water to her brother. Besides the dogs, wild boars also came to visit them. But the settlers had prepared traps near the fence in advance. And unlike dogs, they couldn't jump over the fence. Therefore, stakes were installed in the fence at approximately the height of a boar's head, so that they stumble upon them themselves. So for now, Games only had to deal with the black dogs that jumped over the fence. The next battle is scheduled to start at 5:30 p.m. Only 30 minutes are given to completely destroy the monsters, or the monsters could appear once an hour. Games could still withstand the blows of his enemies for some time, but sooner or later he would run out of steam. If they can survive this day, then the first thing they will need to do in the future is increase the number of warriors. Meanwhile, Rhoda was repairing the fence a little, and Carol was supposed to take Games something to eat, and Alan needed to go get food. Linda asked if he would like to have lunch with her, but he couldn't leave the computer for long, so he wanted to eat at home. Today, she would cook his favorite dish, but nevertheless, he still had to watch the computer. And as he went upstairs, he thought only about seizing the moment and chasing him to the kitchen. At this time, Rhoda was on duty. Behind the fence, 4 black dogs and 3 wild boars were heading towards them. It was the first time Alan had seen monsters of different species unite. After this, Games told Rhodes to go to cover, and he advised him not to overdo it. The boars immediately began to fight, and the black dogs jumped over the fence. While he was killing them, the boars managed to break through the fence, so Alan didn't know if he should summon the stone golem now, since there were 5 hours left until the end. Games jumped over 2 breaking boars and skillfully stabbed one of them. When the second one ran at him, he also hit his head. Alan sincerely admired his strength. Rhoda and Layla volunteered to help so that Games could rest and continue fighting monsters. And at the same time, they asked Carol to hug him so that he could not move. And Kem was supposed to bring ropes and nails. It was very good that Rhoda could be relied upon. When the moon was already shining brightly, Games dozed while Kem prayed. and Rhodas and Layla were slowly patching up the fence. Alan was sure that more monsters would appear now, since the time had already come. And this time, there were about 20 of them. Games felt it too and shouted for everyone to take cover. And this battle was the last wave. Among all the monsters, there was the same one that attacked the cart at the beginning of the game, and his name is the Little Green Goblin. He began to break the stakes in the wall, and apparently, in addition to physical strength, he also had intelligence. That's why they broke through the fence with ease. The boar knocked Games down. Tama wanted to rush to his aid, but Rhodas stopped her. And Layla also tried to hold her back. Now Alan had no doubts left, and he summoned the golem. The screen has changed to a special mode for controlling it. He quickly familiarized himself with how to control it using the console, and began moving towards the exit. The golem passed by them quite quickly, but Kem still understood that it was the god of fate. Games had been fighting all this time, and couldn't let the monsters pass, even if it cost him his life. The goblin was about to chop him down, but the golem cut off his hand. And despite the whole situation, Alan was glad to finally get into the game. He dealt with the dogs skillfully. All this time, while he was watching the battle, he understood how the monsters moved and attacked. So the battle was a piece of cake for him. Although he was used to the controls, he wanted to see if it was possible to do it from a third-person perspective. And fortunately, there was a change of perspective here. On the screen, he saw a golem that was completely different from what he expected to see. But before that, he seemed to have seen it somewhere and compared it to a wooden statue of the god of fate. In the end, he was able to deal with all the monsters while protecting all the inhabitants. And a notification came that all enemy attacks had ceased for today, which made Alan happy. A joyful Kem and Games thanked him with all their hearts. And the Rhodas family, too. Even though it was just a scene in a game, Alan felt embarrassed at being praised. He wanted, like a god, to do something in response to the prayers of the villagers. But the golem stopped moving. The system sent a notification that every second of control, fate points are spent. And when they run out, the golem won't move. And besides, it can only be used once per day. This game turned out to be even tougher than mobile games with donations. But he was at least glad that he was able to save the village. That's why I wanted to tell them that there would be no more attacks today. After that, they returned the statue back to the altar. And finally we prayed. Before leaving, Alan wanted to explore the surroundings. And despite the fact that it was a game, the corpses of the killed animals did not disappear on their own. He noticed an arrow in one of the killed boars, and he realized that Mulus was helping them. When Alan met his colleagues at work, Adrian apologized profusely for letting him down at the end of the month. But Alan told him not to worry about it, because it was good that he had been called to work the day before. And when Adrian offered to buy him something to drink, Alan asked what urgent business he had. He could tell him, but only on the condition that he wouldn't tell the boss. And Alan thought at first that maybe he was going on a date. But as it turned out, it was all because of a game that had a limited time event. He could understand it, since it was a rare event. Adrian had already told him about his addiction to games, and now he was not shy about telling him the real reason. Alan thought for a second that the guy meant the Village of Destiny. He asked him if it was possible that this game was a city-building or role-playing game. But judging by his words, he doesn't play those kinds of games. Therefore, most likely, he had nothing to do with the Village of Destiny. If Alan liked the same games as he did, he would recommend them, but alas. It was great that they could discuss games like this during the break, and that made him a little happy. When he returned home, the processing of the monsters' bodies was completed. The fence repair was in full swing, and, deciding to look through the conversation log, he came across a dialogue between Rhodas and Games. He urged Games to rest, as despite the healing magic, he was still badly wounded. He considered physical work to be his duty. Even Kem advised him not to do anything by force. Suddenly, she was pushed aside by Carol, who was eager to tell Games that she could give him a massage if he wanted. She wanted the little girl not to bother her, but she thought that her older brother liked talking to her more. Luckily, Layla stopped them in time and told them to help her. After Alan summoned the golem, he spent all of his destiny points, although he made up for some of them through gratitude. This time, they got a lot of meat, so Alan could count on an offering and a small increase in points. Since nothing was happening in the game, he decided to go to the kitchen to cook some meat. Just at that moment, Erica returned home, and I noticed that the kitchen smelled very delicious. She couldn't refuse his offer to try. After a while, he put a plate of food before her. She turned out to be very cheerful and joyful, which was unusual for her. And when he smelled alcohol, he understood the reason. After that, the two of them sat down at the table. Alan asked how she was feeling, but she repeated that she was fine, and that she liked her job. But at some point, she seemed to think about it. Alan noticed this, and offered to listen to her so that she would feel better. That's why the girl admitted that someone has been following her lately. The other day she came into the store, and she felt that someone was standing behind her. But when she turned around, no one was there, and she thought she had imagined it. He immediately remembered that same stalker guy from the past. Since she had been returning home late lately, it worried him. Erica was surprised that he was worried about her, and all this time she thought that he hated her. But he believed that she had the right to hate him for everything that had happened. To his surprise, she said that he was becoming his old self, but it started to look a little better. He was a little embarrassed, but still told her to let him know when it was too late to come back, and he would pick her up. While they were writing down each other's contact information, he pointed out that when he was cleaning late at night, it was unlikely he would be able to do so. She was grateful to him for his help, but still didn't want him to be as reckless as before. Although she looked calm, Alan was sure that she was terribly scared. And this time he has to do something. At the end of another shift, Alan asked his boss to drop him off here, as he needed to go to the store for groceries. While in the store, he felt uneasy that Erica's stalker might be nearby. After that very incident, he was taken to the hospital and admitted. At that time, his life was not in danger, but his sister cried all the time. The attacker was sent to a juvenile detention center, and he sent them several letters of apology, but Alan did not feel any emotion in them. After that, he heard nothing about him and did not want to know. When he returned home, he saw a hunched shadow. It was a girl with a crutch, who tried to pick up the keys. They haven't seen each other for a long time. These two have been friends since birth, and they even studied in the same elementary, middle, high school, and university. But then she went to the company she wanted to work for, and he became unemployed. Even when he became a recluse, she wrote him letters all the time. At the time, he was ashamed of his situation, so he did not try to reciprocate her kindness. And it has been 10 years since they saw each other face to face. He asked what happened to her leg, and according to her, she got distracted when she was going down the stairs and tripped. And he involuntarily remembered how, as children, she imitated him and climbed a tree, after which she fell. After this, the girl noticed his form, and he explained that on his father's recommendation, he was working part-time at a cleaning company, and he was sure that she would consider it a pathetic sight. But, to his surprise, she supported him, and he began to feel embarrassed about it. Mary was glad to talk to him for the first time in a long time, and after that, he said goodbye to her, hoping that her injury would soon heal. During this time, Mary has not changed at all, and that lifted his spirits. But still, something still bothered him. She has been with the company for 10 years and is a wonderful adult woman. In turn, he had just started working and had a different life experience. Therefore, I believed that there was a colossal difference between them. Suddenly she came out again, and she mentioned that a new sweets cafe had opened in front of the station. But she was afraid to go there herself, since most of the visitors were young people. So, as soon as her leg healed, she invited him to go with her, and he immediately agreed, saying that he liked sweets. She also felt relief and joy, and after that, she returned home. Only now did Alan realize that this was most likely an invitation to a date, although he tried to push this thought away and began to think that he was simply accompanying her. And now he needed to focus on his sister's stalker. His mother was glad that he returned home early, as the food was already ready, but I was a little scared by his strange smile. A few days later, he had a day off which he wanted to devote to the game. After some time, his sister's stalker never showed up, so perhaps it was just his imagination, and he had a date scheduled for the following Sunday. But for now, he wanted to think about measures against the next temptation of the evil gods. The golem was capable, but so limited that it could only be activated in dangerous situations. And it was a bit of a shame that only games was the fighting force of the village. So he thought he would use the points to replenish his fighting force. And at that moment, Mulis returned to the village. Alan couldn't help but think that it would be great if he joined them. A joyful Carol immediately ran out to him, and she rushed to hug him. He was glad that everyone had survived, but he was ashamed of having abandoned them. But no one held a grudge against him for this, because before that, he had helped them a lot. And besides, the god of destiny also mentioned him. What he liked most about the game was that there wasn't a single idiot among all the characters. Games thanked him for his help during the battle. And since Alan noticed it, then Games even more so should have. Mulis apologized again and wanted to ask them for help. Van said to raise his head, since before this he had helped them a lot, and they were ready to help in return. He lifted his hair, and he showed his ears, thereby proving that he was not an ordinary healer, but a member of a clan living in this forest. And he honestly admitted that his task was to observe strangers. Judging by his ears, Mulis was an elf. When Kem realized that he had known all along how great the danger was, her voice became sharp. This did not go unnoticed by Mulis. But Alan didn't blame her, as her brother had been seriously injured in that situation. Mulis said that he knew what would happen, but the raids had become regular, and the monsters' behavior was puzzling. Games noticed this too, because the monsters had never acted together before. Rhodus had traded in many places before, but he had never heard of anyone raiding other villages. But now the main thing was not that, but to figure out what Mulis's request was for them. And he told them that his settlement was destroyed during the temptation of the evil gods. Even Alan found this a surprise. As far as he remembered, his clan had been living in this forest for several generations, and he thought they must have something against monster attacks. This all led to what he said earlier about the monsters working together and the large scale of the attack. According to one villager who was still breathing, the monsters seemed to be controlled by someone. Games suggested that he bring any survivors here if there were any. But, according to him, there were no survivors left in the village. However, the number of corpses did not correspond to the number of residents, and more than a dozen bodies of children were missing. So he assumed that they were taken to the monster's lair. Alan couldn't even imagine how difficult it was for Mulis to walk alone through the ashes and search for survivors. Since there was at least some chance that they had survived, Games was not going to waste any time and was ready to go with him. Then ran to get a weapon for him, and Layla and Rhodus had to pack food and bottles of water. Mulis was grateful for their help, especially after everything that had happened. Alan also wanted to do something for them, but the prophecy could only be activated once, so he kept it for emergencies. And if he tries to activate the golem, the points will run out before they reach the target. There was no point or time in asking Games to carry the statue. Since Games was going with Mulis, everyone else had to stay in the cave. Then I wanted to go with them, to help, in case there were injured children there. Games tried to warn her that it was dangerous. If the girl took the sacred description with her, then Alan would be able to convey the prophecy to them, but the decision was still up to Games. Carol approached him, and she put something in her hand as a talisman and a memory of her. It was a small wooden statue of the god of fate. In the end, Games couldn't stop his sister, and she decided to go with them, and everyone else said goodbye to them, saying that they would wait for their return. Mulis knew the way to the monster's lair, and it shouldn't take long. They climbed over a small wall, and they reached the river. Mulis suggested making a stop here and resting a bit. An hour had passed since they had left the village, and it was clear that this might be harder for Kem than for others. Mulis didn't know how many monsters remained in the enemy base, but there were many corpses of the creatures around his settlement. His fellow tribesmen did not give up without a fight, so it is unlikely that there will be too many of them. Games thought so too. Black dogs and wild boars lived in this area, but they were unlikely to take any prey with them, so perhaps they were green goblins. At first, Alan thought they were talking about a routine hostage situation, but now he hoped that the kidnapped children were safe. But since this game was designed for realism, it was not surprising that there was a scene of violence. As they walked further along the road, Mulis stopped them, and they hid behind a bush to spy. Below was the settlement of these green goblins, and judging by the number, there are 9 of them. No matter how good the duo of Mulis and Games was, it was dangerous to mess with such a number. If today weren't such a clear day, it would be possible to sneak up. Alan thought about making it rain, and I remembered seeing something like that when I was looking through the miracles section. He found there a weather control that could be used to cause rain, which would muffle footsteps and reduce visibility. He had many options for what kind of weather to summon, but he didn't know if the cost depended on it. Finally, he decided to activate the rainfall. He could move the circle around the screen with the mouse, and use the wheel to increase and decrease the diameter. The larger the diameter, the more points will be spent. And once it is ready, you need to click to perform the action. When everyone looked up, they noticed a rainstorm starting, and the goblins began to hide in their tents. Mulis didn't understand how the weather could change so successfully, but Kem saw a faint light from her book, so she assumed it was the help of the god of fate. They needed to set up an ambush near the parking lot, so Kem had to keep an eye on Games's weapon, and then he and Mulis split into two sides. First, Games entered one of the tents, but I didn't find anyone, and the two of them couldn't find any signs of the children, but we couldn't despair and had to continue searching. After all that was left for them was to find the children and save them. Even after some time, they could not find the children, and there was only one place left in the form of a cave that they had not checked. Games decided that he would go first, but when he approached the entrance, he heard a strange sound. Mulis also couldn't help but notice him, and told Kem to move away. A red cyclops emerged from the cave, and it was him, namely, whom Games did not expect to meet in such a place. He hit him with all his might with the bat, but Games was able to block the shot. Mulis tried to shoot him with a bow, but somehow the cyclops easily blocked his arrow. Therefore, it was unknown whether they would have enough strength to defeat such a monster. Then the cyclops tried to attack Games again, but again he failed. When Mulis fired another arrow, it bent and did not damage his skin at all. Judging by what was happening, even the combined efforts of Games and Mulis were not producing results. Games could barely dodge, and if he misses a hit, he's finished. Why didn't she want her brother to die? So Mulis thought of using a poisoned arrow. He had with him his family's secret poison, for which there was no antidote. If the poisoned tip penetrated, they might have a chance. But he wasn't sure it would have enough strength to pierce the skin. Now, Alan regretted that they had not brought the wooden statue here. All he could do was pass on the prophecy, use poison, or use the power of miracles and the game's equipment. Telling them to leave the Cyclops probably wasn't a good idea either. Therefore, the best way was to leave Games and allow only Kem and Mulis to escape. He was an experienced warrior who understood that he needed to become the enemy's bait. All this time, Alan tried to think of him as an ordinary character in the game, whose death was not real. But it wasn't that simple, so he was worried. After all, a game that was impossible to complete could not be considered a game. Alan tried to remember anything that could help. And suddenly he had an idea. The book was lit up because Alan gave them the plan. And now he needed to activate weather control, namely thunderstorms. Narrow the range of influence to a minimum. And right at the moment when the Cyclops swings at Games, hit him with a lightning bolt. It seemed to help a little, but he was still counting on Mulis. He shot an arrow at the Cyclops, but he stopped her with a log. This was not Alan's whole plan. Then he activated Golem's summon, because there was a small wooden figure tied to the arrow, and I was able to activate it. This golem was small, but he was very good at delivering the bottle of poison straight into the Cyclops' mouth. He began to choke. A little earlier, he had told them in writing that he would cause a thunderstorm, and after the lightning struck, Mulis should aim at its mouth and release an arrow. But they must also pass the poison onto his incarnation and tie it tightly. When the golem was inside his throat, he broke the bottle. The poison spread throughout the Cyclops' body, and he was struck down. Alan would like to join them and rejoice together, but the prophecies for today are over, and it was necessary to save the children. At first, Games wanted to look around inside, since there might still be enemies left there. The two of them waited impatiently for him to return, but the expression on his face was not at all happy. He told Mulis to go inside and check that everything was there, but Kem was supposed to stay outside. She tried to persuade him to let her go with them, but it was his decision as the elder. After they returned back, Mulis fell to his knees. Despite everything, he was grateful to the two of them for answering his call. Games asked him to raise his head, because they were very sorry that they could not help. Even Alan couldn't hold back his tears. After all, it was painful for him to watch Mulis suffer. Then asked if she could pray for the deceased souls to rest in peace. And that was what he really wanted now. Alan then watched as the three of them buried the children. In a normal game, this scene would have been cut, and the action would have moved to the moment of returning to the cave. But this game was not so ordinary. In this game, people live and die. Kem and Games suggested that Mulis return to the village with them, and this time he did not refuse. When they returned, Rhodus' family was already waiting for them. Mulis hugged Carol tightly. Judging by the behavior of the others, Rhodus and Layla realized that they had failed to save anyone. Rhodus tried to at least diffuse the situation a little, and invited everyone to the table for dinner. Layla invited Mulis to stay here as long as he wanted. Alan would like him to stay with the villagers, but he needs to figure out his feelings for himself. If he decided to leave them and be alone, he would not interfere. And whatever the decision, he hoped that his mental trauma would heal. Mula stood on the edge of the cliff and looked down, and after which he jumped from there, and Alan woke up in a cold sweat. Gradually he realized that, fortunately, it was just a dream. So, without wasting any time, he wanted to check how Mulus was doing. He was sitting at the table near the bed and looked more or less okay. Last night, he looked like he was beating himself up over what had happened. But Alan was glad his fears had been unfounded. Carol noticed that Mulus had not yet come out of his room and must be hungry. But Rhodus advised not to disturb him for now. It was clear that he needed more attention. He wanted to see if he had some kind of miracle that could cheer up the villagers. And a new item appeared called Pet Lottery. Once a month, he can try his luck and get a bird egg, an amphibian, a reptile, a monster, or even a rare monster. He could faithfully serve whoever he saw first and be a pet, or he could be fattened up for food. If it is a bird, it will be able to lay eggs, and if it is a reptile, it can be fried and eaten. If it's a monster, it can be used in battle, and if it's a rare monster, it will be even cooler. And since it was free, it was worth trying. Then the roulette began to spin all the egg options. And after he pressed stop, an egg appeared, somewhat similar to a chicken egg. The game notified that this egg would be placed near the village. And, judging by the picture, it was located somewhere near the fence. It was dangerous to leave him there, so he wanted to send a prophecy to the inhabitants. Then she began to read to the others that in the forest you can find a creature in a white, fragile shell. But God didn't know whether it would be useful to them or not. In any case, they could grow it or eat it. A couple of minutes later, Carol found the egg, and I wanted to eat it for dinner. But Layla warned her that since it was a gift from God, it should be cherished. But then the girl unexpectedly brought the egg to the altar, saying that God could take better care of it, and this egg was sent to him as an offering. Layla immediately ran to the altar, asking God for forgiveness for her daughter's actions, although there was no need to worry so much and ask for forgiveness. It looks like Alan will now have to start incubating this egg, but first he needs to figure out what type it is. And judging by the pictures, it looked more like a reptile egg. If that's the case, then it could very well belong to a monster. But he hoped that these were just absurd thoughts. Sometime later, his mother informed him that he had received a package, and I hoped that there was meat or fruit again. When they saw that there was an egg there, Alan told her that there might be a reptile there. Unexpectedly, his mother suggested that he wanted to raise a reptile in order to please Erica. After all, as it turned out, she adored them, and her father, when he was younger, was also into them. He raised lizards before marriage, and Erica raised them herself in her room. Alan had never even known anything like this before, but after Linda saw them a few times, she found them quite cute, but still couldn't get used to them completely. Since the two of them needed to improve their relationship, he should have asked her how to raise a reptile. In the evening, when everyone returned from work, they sat down at the table. And since both his father and Erica were already here, he wanted to ask them both about the egg that they had sent him. Erica was willing to give him some advice, and Benjamin also had some things lying around in the garage for raising reptiles. Luckily, the two were more interested than he expected. When they examined the egg a little later, they confirmed that the egg looked like a reptile, but the shell was very strong. So it could have been a gecko or a crocodile, which was not entirely legal. When they discussed among themselves what was needed to raise this animal, he did not understand a word. Benjamin wanted to bring water and litter, and Erica prepared a feeder and a waterer, and they made a very cozy nest for these eggs. They even didn't forget to take a photo of it with their phone. Until something hatched from the egg, they couldn't give any precise information, so we had to wait. In any case, Alan was very lucky to live with two lizard lovers. And thanks to the Village of Destiny, his relationship with his family became even stronger. A couple of days later, Alan was going on a date, and his mother couldn't help but notice how he looked, so she assumed it too. Of course, she really wanted to know who this girl was, but Alan didn't explain anything and quickly left the house. He waited for Mary for some time at the entrance to the house, after which she left, apologizing for keeping him waiting. Luckily, this time her leg was fine. There were a lot of couples inside the cafe, so it was no surprise that it was uncomfortable to sit alone. Mary, however, enjoyed the desserts that everyone around her was praising, but she felt that if she admired it so much, Alan would think that she would get fat from eating so much sweets. He reassured her by telling her that she looked exactly the same as she did at 20. To his surprise, she told him that his mother had mentioned that he was currently helping to rebuild the village via the internet. That's why I wanted to know what kind of village this was. He couldn't tell her that rebuilding the village was part of the game. After all, he thought that if she found out that he was working only to pay for microtransactions in the game, she would probably feel hostility. And according to the rules of the game, he wasn't supposed to tell anyone. But still, Alan could not deny the fact that after he started playing, his life began to change for the better. He didn't want to look like a liar in her eyes. So I decided that I would only tell her what I felt, without mentioning that it was a game. According to him, it was a small village with a small population. And it is located in a rather dangerous place where wild animals live. Therefore, it is difficult to supply various products there. It took a long time for the village to develop further. But the residents were incredibly nice people who were close to each other. Everyone had their own responsibilities, and everyone worked as hard as they could. Therefore, when he looked at the harsh conditions of their lives, he also wanted to change for the better. He wanted to thank them for the courage they had given him. To do this, he needed money, and he found himself a job. Mary was amazed at how attached he became to these people. He continued to tell her what the inhabitants of this village looked like, and his mouth didn't close until the very end of the evening. When they left the cafe, they were both satisfied, although there was a bit of an argument at the end about who should pay for the food. Since she outplayed him, next time he pays. She couldn't ignore his words, and hoped that he wanted to go out with her again. He didn't deny it, but only if she herself didn't mind. After that, he returned home. But I heard a strange sound, similar to bark beetles. So I rolled up the newspaper to nail them down. When I turned around, I realized that the sound was coming from the egg, and someone very quickly began to hatch from there. Alan began to panic, and tried to remember where he had left his sister's notes. But while he was trying to figure it out, a lizard had already hatched from the egg. So he was able to breathe a sigh of relief that no terrible monster had hatched from there. And besides, she was quite cute. And that's why he wanted to raise her and give her his love. But first, I needed to take a couple of photos to send to Erica and my father. When he tried to search the internet to find out what kind it was, he only found a few similar, but still different ones. But since he was told that such a cage should be suitable for her, then everything was fine. In the evening, his mother called him to dinner, and when he came down, his sister reminded him that she had sent him a message that he had not read. She looked a bit sad today, and he didn't understand why, because he sent her a photo of a lizard and asked her to help identify the species. But it turned out that she was sad because she wanted to see the lizard as soon as she returned home. So he went into the room to get it, even though his mother said the food was getting cold. But as soon as he left the kitchen, he noticed her on the floor, and he didn't understand how she escaped from the cage. He showed the cute lizard to his sister. The mother shouted at them to return to the table, and don't make your father wait, although he too was eager to look at the baby. After dinner, they were convinced that her color was indeed golden. Erica suggested that Plestiodon fasciatus could sometimes be found in Japan, although they were not golden. But if you look at the size and sharp scales, then the father thought that it was a small belt tail, and its color was due to a mutation. Erica asked if Alan had been told how to feed her. Since he knew nothing, he said he'd already given her fruit from the village. He decided to say that the settlement wanted to create a variety of delicacies and animals through selective breeding, so he asked them not to show these photos to anyone. Although the fruits were to her taste, he was asked to monitor what she would eat over time. After some time, everyone finally left his room. No one had ever come into his room before, but now they'll probably pop in more often to look at the little animal. Therefore, it would be better for him to turn off the monitor before leaving the room. When he checked what the residents were doing, Carol was already asleep, and Layla and Rhodus were worried about Mulis's condition. After all, they themselves did not fall into despair only because their family remained intact, and the only thing they could console him with was the words that time would heal the wounds. During the prayer, Kem asked Games for permission to visit the children's grave again to pray, and he agreed to go as soon as Mulis felt better. Mulis took a book out of his bag in his room, and he couldn't understand why the one they needed didn't help them. So Alan assumed he was talking about the sacred writings of the god his people worshipped. But their Bible was different in that it allowed Alan to write something in it. That is why Mulis harbored a grudge against the gods after he saw the miracle that the god of fate performed. Now Alan realized something. If the residents had been attacked while he was working, he would not have been able to help them. If there is a fact of destruction of the faith of the people of Mulis, then there is a possibility that his village will be destroyed unless Alan performs a miracle. His part-time job takes up 3 or 4 days a week. If anything happened during work hours, it would be very bad. So for a moment he thought about quitting and going back to his old life. But it would be sad to miss out on the chance for a new life. So he wanted to come up with a way to keep an eye on the residents while he worked. Only now did he notice that the game had a synchronization system. Since he didn't have a phone before, he didn't even think about it. After he clicked on the link, the game appeared on his smartphone. He won't be able to use it while working, but he can keep an eye on the village during breaks or on the road. After another shift, Alan returned home tired, and I noticed that the lizard was eating something. Since Erica's father and mother were not home yet, it is possible that her mother fed her. Even though he was dying of hunger, he first wanted to see what the situation was like for the residents. Everyone was sitting at the table, and at that very moment Mulis came out to them. He apologized for bothering them all this time, but he asked them to let him stay here. At first, he wanted to leave the forest, but he could not shake off the thought that his comrades might still be somewhere. None of them had any reason to refuse him, and everyone else was glad that there were now more of them. After that, the game system added a sign to it with the name New Villager Mulis, and the information said that this elf was 151 years old. She was a skilled swordsman and an excellent doctor. The fact that she was so old genuinely surprised Alan, and he was no less shocked by the fact that all this time it was a girl, although due to her androgynous appearance, she looked like a guy. But if you think about it, she never hinted that she was a guy. Even Kem didn't notice it. And perhaps she would have reacted a little differently if she had found out that a girl was hunting next to her older brother. In any case, it didn't matter, because the main thing was that they now had a new settler. Suddenly his phone rang. It was Erica asking him to come for her. After all, when she was getting off the bus, she felt like someone was following her, and in order to hide, she rushed to the nearest supermarket. Alan quickly jumped up from his seat, shouting at her not to leave the store, and he got on his bike to get to her faster. When he finally got to her, he hoped she was okay, and despite her words, he saw that she was shaking. He wanted to go and tell that man everything he thought about him. But after some time, after he searched the entire area, he still did not find anyone like him. Erica apologized to him for having to run here for no reason, but he tried to calm her down. After all, he didn't want his sister to go through such a nightmare. At the end of another shift, she texted him that her father would pick her up today, and after that day, he or her father began to meet her at the bus stop to make her feel more comfortable. Sitting in the car, he remembered that he could play Village of Destiny now. When everyone sat down at the table, Mulis asked if they would like to go to his village the next day. But it was unclear why he needed this, because there were ruins in that place. Even though the settlement was burned down, some supplies and useful household items might have remained there. They would be very happy if this were indeed the case, but Games was not so sure. But according to Mulis, the deceased settlers would have been happy if their patrons had taken the food. Carol screamed that she wanted to go with them, but Rodis and Layla weren't sure it was a good idea. Carol thought it was unfair that Kem would go instead of her, because she considered her useless. Then Games himself offered to take her with him. After all, the little girl has been sitting in a dark cave all this time, and she needs to get out into the big world. As soon as Carol heard this, she immediately ran to him. But Kem was against this idea, as it was risky. Games tried to calm them both down by telling them that they had gotten rid of the enemies who had attacked Mulis's settlement, and he would be more worried if he left Carol here. When Kem wanted to object, he tried to convey to her that everyone needed a change of scenery. Alan was happy to see that Games was so helpful to everyone. Luckily, all the bodies were buried, so no one would see the corpses. Since everyone agreed, Mulis suggested going on horseback. After all, there should have been an untouched cart left in the village, on which they could transport everything they needed. While he was playing the game, Adrian managed to take a little peek, and I asked him what kind of game he was playing. Despite the question, his behavior today seemed lethargic or even sad, and he decided to tell him that it was all about that game that he had once told him about. That weekend, he prepared for the event and destroyed one huge base. But after that, his base was destroyed. He was sad that he had poured a ton of money into pumping. Alan tried to cheer him up by saying that he understood him, since he had also invested a lot of money. When he returned home, the residents were just about to move towards the village of Melusa. After they leave the cave, they should come across a river, and beyond it there will be a settlement. It will no longer be possible to get to the other side via the wooden bridge. Therefore, they need to make a detour, and then walk through shallow water. Alan, meanwhile, will be surveying the surroundings from above. As a reward for Mula settling in the village, he could see the places she had been, and he had a wide range of the Forbidden Forest map open up. But even despite the seemingly large territory, he still did not have a clear picture of the entire location. Carol was incredibly happy to get out of the cave, and remarked that Games looked like a knight escorting a princess, and he decided to play along with her. But she said about Kem that she could have been an ideal priestess if not for her little brother complex. They arrived at the required location in less than 5 minutes. At first, Alan wanted to look around, because there could still be monsters here, or something that is better not for children to see. Everything he saw was practically burned, but there was probably still an emergency supply of food left here. But suddenly he saw a small group of people, and at first I thought that these were surviving people, but that was hardly the case. Apart from the man, everyone else looked like ordinary travelers from fantasy novels. He could not read their dialogues, since this required the Bible to be close enough. Alan had tried other objects before and was able to control a small figure, but he couldn't do the same with the statue in the cave. Therefore, he suggested that the game mechanics were based on the Bible. At first, he wanted to warn the settlers about the suspicious group, but he could only write once a day, and the people didn't look like villains. After Mula showed them her destroyed village, she advised the Rhodys family to stay there. But that could happen at any moment in their world, so they saw no need to shield Carol from it. When Games heard a suspicious sound, he told Kem to hide behind it, and the girl noticed that they were not alone here. If these were monster plunderers, then they did not want to let them out of here unharmed. Mulis prepared her bow and arrows just in case, and tried to find out what these people were doing in her village. But suddenly she saw a man named Doldold, and after that she asked to lay down the swords. He seemed glad that Mulis had managed to survive, and then she introduced the man as a merchant who often visited the village. After he listened to their story, he promised to buy all their goods, and after finishing, he asked to go with them to their cave. They collected everything usable from around the village, and then planned to sell the monster meat and ore together. That's why Alan believed that he would buy anything from them. With Mulis's permission, everyone was looking for various things to sell. At first, Alan was worried, but in the end, everything turned out to be a positive, like a bonus. But after that, he remembered how 3 days ago he bought the miracle merchant's visit. But back then, he couldn't understand why it hadn't appeared. And now, apparently, miracles may not appear right away. Eventually, they finished loading the dishes, canned goods, spices, and a few other things, then asked Games to lead a prayer in memory of the people of Mulis. And then they all prayed for the repose of the departed souls. After this, they went to the cave in 2 carts, and Alan was confident that with such an escort, the journey would be smooth. He was already a little hungry, so he wanted to take some meat and fruit, and when he returned to the room with the plates, he wanted to give some to the lizard, only she disappeared. After which he found it on his desk. When he put the plates on the table, she took a piece of meat, and seeing how she swallowed it, he assumed that this lizard was omnivorous. Doldold sincerely admired the settlers' dwellings, since there was no need to worry about rain or wind. Moreover, he had with him an experienced archer, a skilled hunter, and a man who possessed healing magic, a cheerful child and an understanding wife. When Rhodys counted the money, he noticed that there was more than he needed. As it turned out, the man added a little, because he believed that their settlement would develop. To Alan, Doldold did not seem like a nasty person. But since they had already decided this issue, Rhodys wanted to ask about something else. They were short of hands here, so he asked the man to see if anyone wanted to join them. Over the past few years, the number of destroyed villages has increased. He thought that there were probably still people left looking for safe shelter, but he couldn't guarantee it. Besides, the Forbidden Forest was dangerous, so he asked if they would like to change their place of residence. Alan thought that perhaps if the characters left this forest, the game would end, and something told him that the decision to move to the built village did not fit into the developers' rules. If they do agree, Alan will be a little hurt by the realization that he won't be able to play Village of Destiny anymore. But the happy life of the settlers was a priority for him, so he was going to accept any decision they made and not put pressure on them through the prophecy. But suddenly Rhoda said that he would prefer to stay here. He knew that his words were stupid from the point of view of a family man, but since they were under the protection of the god of fate, he considered it a mission, and Layla trusted her husband's decisions. And everyone else wasn't against staying either. Mulis knew no life outside the forest, and did not want to leave the land where her brothers died. Once they had decided so, Doldold had nothing to say about it, and he remembered that he had several people who would like to move here. He promised to return in a couple of days and bring the goods they ordered, and then he set off on his journey. Alan was glad that they all remained in the Village of Destiny and wanted to write them something, the book what it was about. He greeted the newcomer to the village, saying that he was praying for the fallen people. The situation was now developing well, because they had hope for reinforcements in their ranks, and they would be well prepared for the winter. He suddenly remembered that he still hadn't given the lizard a name. Since she looked like a dinosaur, he considered calling her Lizard Man, but she shook her head. He then suggested the name Destiny, which translates as fate, and she liked this name. Sometime later he decided to write to Mary, although he still couldn't get used to it, because she was the one with whom he had broken off contact many years ago. He sent her a photo of a figurine that a girl from the village had made for him to show off. 10 years ago, when she got a job at a large company, he harbored resentment and confusion, because he couldn't find a job anywhere. Because of this, he broke off contact with her. Therefore, I doubted whether I could resume communication with her, as if nothing had happened. But he would not distance himself from her again, because he hadn't been outside for a long time. Communicating with anyone other than his family was difficult for him. Games was someone who didn't like to talk, but got along well with everyone, so he wanted to learn something from him. When Carol asked him what he was going to do, he replied that he was going hunting with Mulis, and judging by her reaction, she was gradually turning into Kem, although she still wished him to return soon. What Alan was now observing did not suit him, because only tough guys could do a pat on the head. Then he decided to look at Rhodus, because he was a simple guy who could perhaps show him how to have an adult conversation. They were just about to make a list of what to offer Doldold and what to get in return. Rhodus didn't know if God helped them with this, but he was still glad that they met the merchant. He thought about going somewhere to buy goods, but he didn't have any extra time. Layla didn't want him to overexert himself too much, but he couldn't afford to relax when he saw how hard Games was working. Alan could understand why he compared himself to him, trying his best and exhausting himself. As it turned out, an additional motivation for him was that he was afraid that Games would take Carol away from him. But it was already too late. But he needn't have worried, because he had a wife anyway. And, looking at these loving shots, Alan even felt a little envious. Alas, none of them helped him, and he had to look for someone else to help him with the intricacies of a woman's heart. His sister was definitely not an option, as that would probably make him laugh. And he remembered that among his friends in the online game, there was a guy who called himself Chick Magnet. But despite his popularity, every time he visited, he was not online. He hadn't written any prophecies yet today, so he wanted to say something harmless. But then I thought about taking advantage of this opportunity. Then she told everyone that they had received a new prophecy. There, he told them that he found it difficult to understand the nature of their love, so he would like to know their opinion. She was very surprised by this, and could not believe her eyes that the deity wanted to know their thoughts on the topic of love. And seeing this reaction, he thought that he had screwed up and lost his dignity as a god. It must have felt weird asking game characters about this, but he had no one else to turn to. While everyone was trying to make sense of what was written, Carol already wanted to take part in it. Van and Carol began to argue about who would be the first to consult God. But Layla advised them to think it over carefully, so that their answer would repay them for their help and support. Despite the girl's determined attitude, Mulis knew nothing about love. Carol read that the guy had a childhood friend, more than just a friend, but not quite a lover. Carol suggested that since they had been together for so long, the girl might have gotten tired of him, because of which these two almost had a fight again. I read that they were separated from each other for a long time, but they re-established communication. But the guy was unsure how to behave. Carol wanted to offer her own option, which surprised her, because she was still a baby. But, as it turned out, she was very popular among the boys in her village, unlike Kem, from whom everyone shied away. Although, perhaps, the whole point was that she was constantly with her brother, who had a rather frightening appearance. Before Layla became intimate with her husband, his invitation on a date was what set things in motion. These words made Rhodus blush a little. Then Kem asked Mulis's opinion, but according to her, elves spent a lot of time developing love and rarely changed their partners. When Alan thought about a date, he remembered their past walks, although now everything was different. He was curious about the types of dates his peers preferred, but he was afraid Mary wouldn't be interested. What she wanted was for a person to enjoy a relationship with her. Layla liked it when guys on dates put on airs and showed off in front of her. And, of course, she couldn't forget how Rhodus had tried to show gallantry before and failed. Alan would have liked to follow this advice, but the date wasn't quite right for him, although he did get some things out of it. He tried to figure out how to start a dialogue with her, and finally I decided to ask her if she was free today and would like to go for a walk. The message seemed to him as if it had been written by a child, but he still decided to send it. Suddenly, Destiny grabbed him by the jacket to comfort him, and this made Alan feel a little better. She received his message while she was at work, and when she sent a reply, Alan quickly grabbed his phone to find out what was there. She was glad of his invitation, but today was a weekday, and Alan counted it as a failure. Although it seemed like she didn't mind, which meant he could try his luck again. The girls were curious about what the god of fate was doing now after their advice, and whether he was asking other followers. But what interested Kem most was what happened to that guy, because he looked worried. Alan wanted to tell them how it all went and correct a couple of details. Then he wrote about it in a book, and they were glad that their advice helped arrange a date for a follower. Apparently, they were even more captivated by his story than he had imagined. They even reminded him a little of his mother and Erica when they watched all sorts of dramas. So it occurred to him that they were simply starved for entertainment. They are constantly busy developing the village and do not have enough time for leisure. So he decided to share his awkward story a little more. He asked them again to help with advice, hoping for their kind cooperation. And he said that his follower managed to invite his girlfriend for a walk, but he didn't know where it would be best to go. Then suggested the option with the theater. As it turned out, Layla and Rhodus' first date took place right there. Carol and Mulis also agreed with this. Alan had never been to the theater before, so he decided it would be better to go to the cinema. But if he doesn't take the advice, they will all probably be disappointed. He decided to call Mary again and asked when she had a day off. After this, he sent another prophecy with gratitude for the advice and words that he would stop pestering them with questions. If the village ever becomes safe, it would be great to send such harmless letters. And now it was time to earn some money for the village and the date. After he returned, he received a message on his phone from Erica. She had taken on overtime today and wanted him to meet her at the bus stop when she finished. He didn't mind, considering the fact that there was a supermarket nearby where you could buy sweets and juice. He quickly changed his clothes and decided to pop into the store before his sister arrived. But at the moment when I entered, I met a man with a very familiar face. It was the same stalker who made Alan constantly feel like someone was watching him. When they were younger, he promised Erica that he would deal with her stalker. He looked like an ordinary child, to whom it was enough to raise one's voice. But then he didn't even think that he would have the courage to stab him with a knife. This guy grew up in this city, so sooner or later they are bound to cross paths. But he was hanging around the store near the bus stop where Erica arrives. And it would hardly be a coincidence if she met him on the way home. So maybe it was him who was scaring her all this time. At first, he wanted to call the police, but the last time he did it, it didn't produce any results, and he had to come up with something before his sister arrived. Alan didn't want her to be scared again, so he gathered all his confidence and walked out of the store. If he screamed, 2 people nearby could hear him, so it shouldn't come to a fight. He turned to this guy. He didn't recognize him, so Alan had to clarify whether he was the one convicted in his sister's case. Only then did he remember that it was Erica's older brother in front of him. Unexpectedly, he bowed, saying that he regretted having caused such monstrous evil. It was quite an unexpected and interesting reaction. He tried to calm him down by saying that all of this was in the past, and he too needed to think before saying anything. But he continued to say that he regretted injuring him back then. The trauma had taken a toll on him, and he wanted to tell the guy everything. But his sister's safety was a priority. If he hadn't known him before, he would have thought he was a nice young man. And from the outside, of the 2 of them, he would look more like a stalker. Alan accepted his apology, but still wanted him to stay away from his sister. The guy explained that his feelings got out of control that day, and he stumbled. But in that case, Alan didn't understand why he continued to follow Erica, and he told him that he had seen him here for the second time. Of course, it was all a bluff, because he wasn't sure if it was really him. But he was wondering how he would respond to this provocation. After Alan exposed him, there was no point in pretending anymore, and all this guy's repentance was a lie. That day, he was rummaging through the trash behind her when he came running out screaming. Because of him, the guy got furious and stabbed her. Because of Alan's family, Chris's whole life went downhill. He looked like he had gone crazy. But be that as it may, he had no right to hang around Alan's sister. Chris tried to push the point that his brother wanted to interfere in his sister's personal life again. But even if he wants to report him to the police, he won't succeed, because he has a ton of friends from prison. When Alan asked about the meaning of his surveillance, he replied that it was pure love. At school, he admired her, but he didn't have the courage to talk to her. After his imprisonment, he had time to think things over, and over time, his thoughts became more aggressive. All he could think about was that he wanted her to beg for help on her knees before him and cry. After all these remarks, Alan would like to run away with his tail between his legs. But he didn't want to regret anything anymore and close his eyes to the past. Chris tried to scare him with the police, because if he raised his hand against him, it could be considered a crime. Alan was no fool, so he recorded the entire conversation on a dictaphone from the very beginning. Since he found Alan on the day of the plan's execution, he wanted to kidnap him along with his sister, and when he turned around, he noticed 2 people walking towards him. These 2 were his friends from the penal colony. Initially, as a form of revenge, they wanted to make a video for him starring them and Erica. But now it will be a live show personally for him. The guy was nothing less than the last creature on this earth. He was bursting with anger, but he couldn't hit them because there were 3 of them there. There was no one around to help, and it was unlikely that anyone would have heard his screams. He remembered how Games and the others had put their lives on the line fighting monsters. And compared to them, those who surrounded him were just ordinary people. The boy mocked him for deciding to fight while they were armed, but he noticed that, thanks to his training, they were a little afraid of him. He shouted at Chris that if he did something, he wouldn't get off so easily. But the guy was confident in his abilities because his friends belonged to the same criminal group, and everything would be settled. If Alan makes it to the store, they won't touch him, and he can call the police to report people with guns. They had a stun gun, a police baton, and a knife with them. If he approaches the guy with a knife, he risks getting fatally wounded. And if he is paralyzed by a stun gun, he won't be able to do anything. So there was only one option left. He grabbed the guy with the baton by the arm, and he dodged in order to break away from them and run to the store. But suddenly 2 more people came up, and they were all clearly angry that Alan decided to play with them. Chris considered breaking his legs to prevent him from escaping. A situation in which 5 people attack one was not part of Alan's plans. But suddenly one of them started coughing and couldn't breathe. The other one also started grabbing his throat, and the other 2 had watery eyes. They all fell to the ground, leaving Alan and Chris in disbelief. Thanks to this, he now had a chance to escape. He decided to turn this to his advantage by saying that he would not have come to the man who stabbed him without preparation. And if he doesn't want his friends to die, he has to take them to the hospital. But instead, Chris lunged at him with a knife. However, he was unable to hit him. After all, foam started coming out of his mouth, and he fell to the ground. He didn't look like he was pretending like the others. The only thing that was clear was that something strange had happened. He could leave them lying there, but if there was a small chance they were dying, he might be a suspect. So he went into the store and shouted to the salesman that there were 5 guys on the street, unconscious and foaming at the mouth. When Erica finally arrived, she found a scene where people were being taken away on stretchers by ambulance. Alan was just being questioned by the police about what he was doing in the store. And at the same time, the policeman asked about his relationship with these people. But it was quite a long story. The policeman wanted to look through his things, and Erica came running to find out what had happened. He gave the policeman the backpack to see what was inside. He explained to Erica that the people had lost consciousness due to poisoning. He needed to talk to the police, and her father would pick her up. Suddenly, the policeman became afraid of what was in the backpack, and there was Destiny. He didn't understand when she had managed to get into the backpack. He explained to the man that it was his pet lizard. The man wanted to question him in more detail and asked him to go with him to the station, but he didn't resist. But before that, he gave the lizard to Erica so that she could take it home. After this, he said goodbye to her, saying that he would explain everything when he returned. They talked until the early morning, and he explained the whole situation, mentioning the former stalker who tried to kill his sister. He let them listen to the tape recording, after which the police took up his case. Luckily, he stopped the recording at the right moment, and there were no questions for him. Afterwards, he finally left prison. And, as it turned out, Erica and his father came to meet him. They were worried, so they decided not to go to work and pick him up instead. Erica felt guilty for dragging him into this, after asking him to come get her. Alan wanted to counter her apology. But my father suggested that we go home, since it would be strange to have a conversation in front of the police station. As they drove, Alan thought about how much he had to tell them. Even if he lies, sooner or later they will hear about the stalker incident, and Erica might also be called in for questioning. So, if they hear about it from him, they might not be as shocked. After Alan told them everything, Erica was very angry that the boy remained a psycho. Benjamin understood her feelings, but she still had to calm down. Besides, he wanted to scold Alan for his careless actions. You could tell from his tone that he was holding back his anger. If those guys hadn't lost consciousness then, he and Erica might have had to go through hell. However, Alan tried his best for his sister, so as a father he was proud of him, which almost made Alan cry. What bothered him was that during the attack they were paralyzed by poisoned food, which seemed like a blessing from God. Detectives had previously told Alan that the men had gone out to pick up oysters to celebrate early, and may have contracted the infection there. But it was unlikely to be poisoning. Foaming at the mouth, yes, but suffocation and itchy eyes weren't included. It all looked as if they'd inhaled poisonous gas. But it was unclear why Alan was the only one unharmed. When he returned home, his mother was worried if he was okay, but he asked her not to worry. When he came into the room, he greeted Destiny, and for a moment he thought that she might be to blame for that mysterious phenomenon. Although a minute later he already thought it was impossible. When he decided to check on the residents, everyone was going about their usual business, and he was very grateful to everyone for giving him the courage to protect his little sister. After that, he decided to go to bed, as after this ridiculous day he was completely overcome with fatigue. The next morning, his mother told him that a guest was waiting for him, and it turned out that Mary came to them. He was surprised, because at this time she should have been at work. But, as it turned out, she learned about the situation that happened recently, and was worried, so she took a day off from work. But he was fine, so she didn't have to worry. It had been a long time since the three of them had sat together like this. But the atmosphere was strange, because the two had been happily chatting until he came in. Before this, Erica had already told Mary almost everything. Erica didn't want to ruin the atmosphere for the two, but she wanted to know if the stalker incident was resolved. They have now been hospitalized, but will most likely be arrested, as a detailed assassination plan was found on their phones. Thanks to this, Erica was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Alan asked her to contact him if anything happened again, and watching them, Mary was glad that they were getting along again. Suddenly, Mary asked if she and Alan could be friends again, and he agreed without question. But at the same time, he understood that it was dishonest of him to start communicating with her again, given that he had been avoiding her for many years. All this time, he thought that he needed to meet her in person and apologize. So he bowed and asked for forgiveness for rejecting her, and would like to start being friends with her again. To his surprise, she forgave him very quickly, although all this time he thought that she hated him to death. But, as it turned out, she left home due to a change of job, and could not return due to frequent business trips. The dialogue between the two sounded extremely awkward in front of Erica, but suddenly she got scared when she saw something on the floor. Destiny appeared in their room, having run away in the same way as before. And even though he and Erica liked her, Mary asked to put her away. She never got along with amphibians and reptiles from the very beginning. Alan decided to convince her that Destiny was no longer here. But when Mary opened her eyes, he brought it very close to her face. This caused Mary to scream and crawl away. She always hated this part of Alan. So now he had to apologize again while Erica laughed at him. Meanwhile, Adrian was playing a game on his phone at home, and he looked very tense because one of his bases had collapsed after being attacked by 3 people. And besides, he was annoyed by how much money he had invested in this game. A few days later, Duldold returned to them, and he brought what they asked for, and also took with him those who wanted to move here. The man introduced them to a married couple from the Bearcat family, Can and Lan. They reminded Alan of red pandas that walk on two legs. They looked unusual, so Alan was worried about how the locals would greet them. And fortunately, they responded very positively. The couple were skilled workers who knew how to work with wood, and were skilled in the processing of stones and metal. And, by the way, they had already lived in this cave with the dwarves before. If these guys have crafting skills, they could be very useful for the development of the village. And besides, they looked very cute. At this rate, several days had passed since their arrival. Since there was no free space in the cave, it was necessary to expand the living perimeter and build a home for this couple. Now they were working with Games and Rotus on setting up the pantry. It also turned out that these two were spearmen. Most representatives of the beast races were endowed with better physical characteristics than humans, and therefore were good fighters. Meanwhile, the girls helped Mulus collect medicinal herbs to make medicinal potions. Some time ago, they had already sent him medicine as an offering. He assumed it wouldn't do any harm, but he was still afraid to use it, and he treated it as a good luck charm. Preparations for the next temptation of the evil gods were in full swing, and if he works half shifts until the end of the month, he will be able to accumulate points for the golem. Last time he was nervous, but now he couldn't wait for the end of the month. After the four had finished their morning work, it was time to have lunch before tackling the next area. Next, it was time to take a break in the car and start night work. By the end of the year, cleaning was in demand everywhere, so December will be hot. And it happened that they would start work in the morning and finish the next morning, after which they would be given a day off. In this situation, he was already at his limit. He increasingly wanted to rest and relax, because he felt crushed. When he returned home, his mother was worried that he had not had dinner, but he explained to her that he wanted to go to bed right away. He greeted Destiny as he walked into the room, and immediately he plopped down, tired, on the bed. And I was sure that people who are able to go to work every day are amazing. For him, as someone who hadn't done this for a long time, they were all objects of respect. The next morning, he was awakened by his alarm clock. But he decided not to get up and watched the village through his phone. Carol brought her favorite fruit as an offering to the statue. And at the same time, she told me how she hopes that everything will be all right during the next temptation of the evil gods. This gave him a little strength, so he decided to get up. While Alan and Adrian were busy cleaning, the manager suddenly shouted at them to try harder. Adrian apologized first. The man couldn't help but notice his condition and how sleep-deprived he was, and suggested that he go home. But he continued to say that everything was fine and that he needed money now. Even Alan noticed his strange behavior lately. He used to be more bright and outgoing. Now he's constantly immersed in the game during breaks, and conversations just don't flow. Of course, Alan was worried about him, but he himself had no time to worry about anyone else right now. Adrian suddenly came up from behind and noticed that Alan was addicted to playing a game on his phone. And, according to him, he played it too. His goal was to crush the enemy's stronghold and use money to increase the number of monsters under his control. He went on about how exciting it was to play the villain, to explore the idea of destroying the human race. For him, the game system was such that if he won, he accumulated points and spent them on summoning new monsters. But if you invest money, the number of available points will increase. Alan could only imagine what it would be like to play as an evil god in this game. In Mulus's case, he couldn't shake the suspicion that there were other players in the game. But he never imagined that he too would be on the side of evil. However, Adrian mentioned that the game also had a quid pro quo option. If you destroy an enemy stronghold, you can get more points and convert them into cash. Alan didn't know about this, because all he got were offerings from his village. Adrian had already used his points this way once and was amazed. After all, in the end, he received 5 million. His family has money problems, because after his father disappeared, he took on the debts, which is why he had to work. And just when he was close to paying everything off, his mother ran away with her new man, taking all the money. Some might say that children are not obligated to pay their parents' debts. This is an expression of irresponsibility. But he didn't feel he had to pay for them. His entire youth and early adolescence became the price to pay for this. Alan was sure that there must be a way to relieve a child from having to pay for his parents. He believed that a child should not have to pay off debts to which he had no connection. Adrian might have been called a coward, but he was admirable in his eyes. That is why the game he played was an additional income for him. With her help, he almost paid off his debts, and she was the only chance to change his life. But Alan still didn't understand why Adrian was telling him all this. Suddenly, he mentioned the swordsman with the scar on his face, and Alan realized that he meant Games. That's why Alan was afraid that he might realize that he was on the enemy side. And all this time, they were fighting each other without even realizing it. Judging by his appearance, he was determined to win the next temptation of the evil gods. And any loser will also lose the game itself, according to the rules. Suddenly, he turned around and started to walk away. So, he assumed that with his story, he wanted to convince him to leave the game. After all, for him, this game may be the only chance to get out of a difficult situation. But for Alan, it was like that too. When he discovered her, his life took off. For the villagers, he is a benefactor, so he could not let them die. He gathered all his determination into a fist, and he was ready to meet Adrian fully armed. On December 30th, the manager said goodbye to the employees until next year. Lily also wished everyone a happy new year, but Adrian looked too downcast. The temptation of the evil gods was supposed to start tomorrow, and he wasn't eager to fight Adrian. But as long as this game exists, and he continues to be a player, this issue needs to be resolved somehow. When he returned home, he remembered that everyone was going to go to his grandfather's house. He would like to visit him too. But tomorrow he will have to concentrate on the game. But suddenly someone's voice came from the kitchen, and as it turned out, Mary was cooking there. He didn't understand what she was doing there, but his mother asked her to take care of food for him. Seeing his reaction, she thought that he had already managed to eat somewhere. But he, on the contrary, was dying of hunger. Since that was the case, he asked what was for dinner today. But suddenly, under his feet, he found Destiny, who had slipped away again. He quickly grabbed her in his arms so that Mary wouldn't have time to see her. But then I remembered that, since everyone had left, someone had to feed her. He asked her to wait a little, and then give her twice as much food. And after that, they came to an agreement. When Mary turned around to see what was going on, he quickly hid her behind his back and said he was going upstairs to change. After that, they sat down at the table, and Mary asked him how he liked the food she had prepared. He couldn't help but praise her miso soup, and at the same time, he asked her to treat his sister to it next time. But when Mary mentioned that she had taken several lessons from her, Alan didn't even know that she could cook. Mary asked if she could come here tomorrow. He was grateful to her for this, but still didn't want her to overdo it. But since she had quite a lot of free time, she will be able to come here without any problems. And at the same time, she invited him to eat New Year's noodles together. When December 31st arrived, Alan was preparing for the temptation of the evil gods. Rhodus and Layla were discussing something near the table. Mulis was surveying the area. What did you pray with? And Games, together with Can and Lan, prepared their weapons. Destiny decided to join Alan. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Mulis reported that 5 black dogs and ferocious boars were approaching them. As the dogs approached, Mulis shot at one of them, and surprisingly, they ran away after her shots. Besides this, they came up with some other defenses. Suddenly, one of the boars fell into the trap, and the dog followed him. Last week, through the oracle, he suggested setting traps and install spiked stakes. The boars, charging straight ahead, collided with the stakes at the level of their foreheads, because of which they themselves died. The black dogs, however, were a problem because they were strong enough to jump over the fence and had poisoned fangs. Mulis shouted to the others that 3 black dogs were running up to the fence. And once they jumped over, Games, Can, and Lan quickly dealt with them. Luckily, no one has been hurt here so far. Compared to last time, when they only had 1 game, Alan felt calmer now. While there was time, Games suggested updating the traps, and thus following the oracle's advice. If he had control over these monsters, he would never have fallen into these traps twice. But if the player who controls them can only give them simple instructions, then they will be effective. As night approached, the monsters' power grew, so they waited for the right moment. As time went on, Games, Mulis, Khan, and Lan were doing a great job of dealing with the monsters. And Kim, Layla, and Carol brought them water to drink. Rhodus suggested that Mulis replace her. So far, everything has gone very well, and perhaps this will lead to an outright victory. But he was still curious about how Adrian was doing now, and he was thinking about calling him. But if he does that, he might make him angry. If his real-life connections are severed, he still has the game. And he had long ago decided to protect all the inhabitants of his village. After another hour and a half, the monsters for some reason did not attack. This was the first time something like this had happened in his memory, even taking into account past experience. Layla and Rotus assumed that the monsters might think they couldn't defeat them, so they stopped attacking. But Games didn't agree with this. Alan knew that Adrian would put everything he had into this fight, so he doubted the end was near. Suddenly, he heard some noise downstairs and assumed it was Mary, but I still went to check. When he went down to the kitchen, there was no one there. Then he suggested that she might be in the living room, but when I opened the door, I saw a broken window and an unknown man in a mask. Alan immediately thought it was a robber and wanted to call the police, but I saw white hair, and he immediately realized that it was Adrian in front of him. A few months earlier, Adrian received an unknown letter in the mail, and when I opened it, I read that he had been chosen to be a tester for the game Impulse of Destruction. Since he had nothing better to do anyway, he decided to give it a try. He immediately liked the graphics, which looked promising, and from what he understood, he needed to create monsters and watch them attack the enemy camp. But you can't control them yourself. At that very moment, a man started knocking on his door, and he demanded the money be returned this month. If he couldn't, he was ready to threaten. But suddenly, Adrian transferred some amount of money. The man was convinced that the amount there was quite large, so he wondered where he got so much money. But Adrian didn't answer him, and after that, the man left, telling him not to create problems. When Adrian returned to his room, he still couldn't believe that this game allowed him to withdraw money in the real world. He left her for a while, but then he became curious and decided to see how things were going. And he saw that his monsters attacked a small enemy fortification for which he was awarded points. When he looked at the ways they could be used, he saw conversion into cash. So now he could pay his bills while creating monsters to destroy large fortresses. It all seemed like a waking dream to him, and now he was going to use this game to pay off his debts. After some time, the manager came to introduce the new guy to them, and at that moment he noticed that, despite his good physique, he had a pale complexion, and overall he looked strange. He was also well motivated, but since the work was hard, Adrian thought that he would soon give up. But even after some time, Alan still tried his best and had a responsible approach to the matter. When the temptation of the evil gods arrived, Adrian was defeated and did not understand what kind of new character had appeared in the form of a golem. Next time, he thought about bringing the red demon here. During breaks, he discovered that he and Alan liked to play games, so maybe they would get along. But when he returned home, he was shocked that his red demon was defeated. And the one who did this was the same swordsman he had encountered the day before during the attack on the cave. If there is a reduction in the number of troops available for attack, he will not be able to earn points as effectively as before. Then he noticed that Alan was playing some game on his phone, and he saw there the same guy who had defeated his red demon. It was at that moment that he realized that Alan was playing the same game, but on the enemy side. Then he decided to find out if he knew that Adrian was also in this game. He harbored a grudge against him, thinking that he was laughing behind his back and pretending to be friendly. Now he was going to change his life with the help of this game, so he wouldn't let anything stand in his way. When the temptation of evil gods began, he unleashed his monsters. But they started falling into traps, and they looked stronger than last time. He planned to smear him, but with such meager forces, he couldn't harm him. He could have thrown all his forces at once, but Alan had an ace up his sleeve. So he came up with the idea of distracting Alan from the game for a while. The guy tried to come to his senses so as not to entertain such strange thoughts. After all, if he does this, he will cross out his entire life up to this moment. So he pulled himself together, knowing that as the night approached, the monster's strength increased. And now he wanted to walk to the store to cool off. But when he went out, he met a suspicious guy, who asked if Adrian believed in God. The first thing he thought of was some kind of religious agitation. Although, judging by the way he looked, he was clearly not very religious. According to him, he was quite a believer. But I meant evil God. And somehow he got Adrian under his control. Although Alan wasn't completely sure, he still hoped it was Adrian. He finally took off his mask, and he looked absolutely distraught. Alan carefully tried to find out what he was up to, and asked him to put away the thing in his hands. Adrian was sure that Alan knew why he was here. Alan decided not to resist him, and answered honestly that he was a hindrance to him in the game. Adrian told him that if he kept quiet, he wouldn't get into any unnecessary trouble, and he asked him to simply sit and wait for the temptation of the evil gods to end. Even though Alan tried to scare him by saying it was a crime, He thought that after he asked Alan to step aside, he would stop. But for him, it was impossible. If he didn't make a fuss, neither would Adrian. So he asked him to think of it as hanging out with a colleague. Alan was sure that they wouldn't believe him so easily. But the words from a guy who had spent his whole life locked up didn't sound any more convincing. Alan couldn't argue with that, since he hadn't done anything for the last 10 years, and his social status was 0. And Adrian worked hard to pay off his debts, stay in good standing, and be valued by the company. So there was no point in thinking about whose side they would be more willing to take. Adrian admitted that he had no intention of injuring him and being labeled a criminal, and simply asked him to behave reasonably and humbly. At the same time, he offered him to take half of the winnings from the raid, so that they would both be winners. In that case, if he doesn't resist, then the other person will pay him, and will most likely continue to be friendly at work. And only the Village of Destiny will disappear from his daily life. Before giving his answer, Alan wanted to ask him something. He asked if he felt guilty about attacking the village, seeing other living characters die because of him. He didn't understand what Alan was talking about, because even though the game had realistic graphics, it was still a game. But even if they were real people, they could be viewed as civilians who died in war zones. But Alan still believed that these NPCs were much more alive and lived each day to the fullest. They were much more alive than he was, so they were not strangers to him. Adrian thought he was an idiot and couldn't understand how he had wanted to get along with him all this time. Alan tried to ask him to come to his senses, but Adrian was tired of fighting all his life. He had to drop out of high school because he was born into a dysfunctional family. And all his life, until he was 20, he had to work hard to pay the bills. But Alan was a lucky guy for him, born into a good family, and he would never know the true value of money. He was someone who hadn't worked a day in 10 years and didn't know how much it would take to feed himself for a year. That's why he couldn't even imagine how much his family had to work so that he could live here. Alan had nothing to say in response to these words. He saw the world as bad and just lived without interfering in the lives of others, and thought that everything was fine. Adrian believed that he, as someone who lacked proper education and talent, finally got his chance. He knew that to have a good life, he needed to graduate from college and get a job, but at the same time, he would not have the most beautiful life in society. Alan knew that, being the one who sat idly by when nothing threatened him, he would not be able to dissuade Adrian from refusing. Suddenly Adrian froze, not knowing what to say, because Alan started to cry. He called Adrian a wonderful person, but to him it sounded like sarcasm. Alan went on to say that he had never thought before how lucky he was, and that he had lived so long without worrying. If he had realized this earlier, he might have had a different future, but he became a burden to many people. If he had even a little courage, he could have done anything. Adrian thought it was cheap pity, and if he was so overcome with emotion, then he should sit down and watch. Adrian handed him the phone screen, and he showed that the final assault on the temptation of the evil gods was about to begin. Residents felt the earth shaking. When Games climbed the observation tower, he saw how many monsters were coming towards them. This was an attack that Adrian had put everything he had into, and if he didn't destroy this base, it would be the end for him. Therefore, he was ready to sacrifice the village. When Alan tried to do something, Adrian threatened him not to make a move. Just at this time, Mary came to him, heard loud voices, and thought that he was there with his friends. But since the situation was dangerous, he shouted at her not to enter. When she finally entered the room, she found a very strange picture.